to order the joint meeting of the Historic Landmarks Commission with the Planning Commission of July 20th, 2011. I will open public comment. Any member of the public may address the Historic Landmarks Commission for up to 2 minutes on any subject within our jurisdiction that is not scheduled for public discussion before the board today. Seeing no one. Yep. Okay. Oh, yes.
Okay, there you go.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Wanda Livernoy, 533 Brinkerhoff. There is a building on the corner of Haley and Dilavina that is in the Brinkerhoff district, and it's being painted. And several neighbors and myself have wondered how that color happened to get chosen, because it is a city-owned property. Now, there are no bad colors, of course, but I do think that it's inappropriate on that California cottage. So I would like to know how it happened and get a response before too long, because there are several neighbors that are very anxious.
Okay. And Ms. Livernoy, did you say that was Haley and Chapala?
Haley and Dilavina. I think it's 136 West Haley is the exact address.
Okay. We will have staff look into that. Thank you, Ms. Livernoy. Any other member of the public wishing to comment?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Jessica Grant,
Welcome.
Public Works Department. I had a quick inquiry today. I'm assisting the county with the Lower Mission Creek Flood Control Project, Lower Reach 1A, which is currently under construction right now. And Lower Reach 1A is just north of the State Street Bridge, and then just slightly north of the Ped Bridge of the Ramos Santos Harbor View and project. The construction management team alerted me that they're going to have some shotcrete samples of the wall available next week, and we're curious if any maybe one or two members is available to do a courtesy review. I don't have the exact day and time yet, but if anybody is interested, we also have David Black available doing a review as well.
I will volunteer and I will appoint Commissioner Lavoie.
Okay.
Anybody else want to volunteer for that? We can have up to 3 people, I'm assuming. Okay. Commissioner Sharp, Commissioner Lavoie, and Commissioner Suding.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Grant. Any other public comment, general public comment? See no one, I will close public comment. And I am going to postpone approval of the minutes until the end of the meeting, since we just recently received those minutes, and give us a little time to review them. Then we'll move on to the consent calendar. Staff?
Mr. Chair, item A, 1111 East Cabrillo Boulevard was indefinitely continued with comments. Item B, 210 West Carrillo Street was continued 2 weeks. Item C, 1816 State Street was final approval as submitted. And item B, 210 West Carrillo was continued 2 weeks to the full board. Item D, 33 East Mitchell-Torrena Street was final approval as submitted. Item E, 520 Plaza Rubio was final approval as submitted.
You were busy.
1114 State Street. Item F was final approval as noted. Item G, 1900 Les Wayne was final approval as submitted. Item H, 1900 Les Wayne was final approval as submitted. And item I, 1900 Les Wayne was final approval as submitted. Those were all reviewed by Commissioner Sharp.
I have a motion by Boucher, second. Second by Schallenberger. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item on the agenda is announcements, requests by applicants for continuances. Cross my fingers.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Drury is going to be absent from today's meeting. Chair Suding and Vice Chair Sharp are invited to the semi-annual advisory group meeting being hosted by Community Development Department. Meeting will be on Wednesday, September 7th in room 15 of City Hall. So invitations will actually be sent to you in August by mail. A 101 Cabrillo Pedestrian and Bike Path DRT meeting will be held on Thursday, July 28th at 11 a.m. in the Public Works Conference Room, and that's Commissioners Suding and Arias will be attending that meeting. Thursday, July 28th, 11 a.m. A status report will be given to City Council on August 16th regarding the proposed changes to De La Guerra Plaza, and then the Historic Structures report and the Archaeological Resources report are tentatively scheduled for HLC review on August 17th. And I believe Mr. Jacobus has an announcement.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, I know that most of you know that I've been ill for quite a while. I've been suffering with Parkinson's disease for going on 5 years now. And I also have an issue with post-traumatic stress disorder from an incident got bad in the military. I put those two together and I'm just a wreck. So basically, I'm going to be leaving the city. I'm going on long-term medical leave. Due to my failing health, it's not likely that I'll be back. I just wanted to express my gratitude of being able to work with this commission. It's been a real experience. Watching the dynamics of the commission change over the years has also been fun for staff to try and keep up with which direction to advise applicants, because the commission dynamics would change so much. But again, it was a great pleasure. I really enjoyed working with the city. Staff is a great bunch of people we have. I don't think I've worked with a more professional group of people than I have with this staff here. So with that, this will be my last meeting, and you'll still be seeing reports and things with my name on them, because I've tried to keep things ahead a little bit so that projects wouldn't fall behind. But this will be the last time you'll probably see me. And with that, I turn it over to you.
Mr. Jacobus, I think I can speak on behalf of the rest of the commissioners. We will greatly miss you. We wish you the best. I know that we will be running into you now and again. You are a valuable resource to us as a commission as well as to the city. We've appreciated your timely response to all of our questions, all of the public's questions, all the applicants' questions. It's a tough thing to wrangle 9 members of a commission and have public at you as well. But I think I can speak on behalf of the rest of the commissioners that we will greatly miss you as a resource and as a human being here at our meetings. But hopefully see you other places. Absolutely. I'll run into you on State Street, I'm sure. Thank you, Mr. Jacobus. Any other announcements? Ms. Ovias.
The Historic Resources Development Task Force is going to be meeting on August 3rd, I believe, at 8:30 in the morning at the building across the street. And we will be putting out an agenda, and in talking with staff members, we're urging...
Commissioner Rios, you need to speak into the microphone.
And in talking with staff members, we need to urge you to get your input in on the various issues that we discussed at the last meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Rios. Any other announcements? None. Any subcommittee reports from any commissioners? None. Then we will move to the first item on the agenda. We are 5 minutes early. The first item on the agenda is a historic structures report for 2559 Puesta del Sol. It's a review of a historic structures and site report prepared by Post Hazeltine Associates. The report found that the following buildings are eligible for City of Santa Barbara landmark status: the main museum building, including the original museum, Gould Indian Hall, Botany Hall, Fleischman Mammal Hall, Library, Local Birds Hall, Reserve and Collections Building, Administration, the Director's House, the Hazard Carriage House and Wall, and the McVeigh House. This is a joint meeting with the Planning Commission. Chair Justice, do you need to call roll on your end?
I think for protocol purposes, it would be nice to call roll.
We'll call roll. Yep. Commissioner Lodge, Commissioner Bartlett,
Here?
Commissioner Jacobs, Commissioner Jordan, Commissioner Larson,
Here.
Commissioner Schwartz,
Here.
and Chair Jostis.
Here.
Thank you. Staff.
Yes, Mr. Chair. What you have before you,
I'm sorry.
From the staff, the Planning Commission. I just want to remind the Planning Commissioners that you do not have purview over this issue, even though you've opened the joint meeting. The Historic Structures Report is under the sole purview of the Historic Landmarks Commission.
Thank you. Point of order. Yeah. Mr. Jacobus.
try that again, thank you. Basically, what you have before you is a Phase 1 structures report. I decided that it would be, because of the monstrous size, as you can see, this is just the determination as to what has historic value and what hasn't, that this document's going to grow. So staff determined that it would be best to create a Phase 1, which basically analyzes all the buildings, structures, objects, landscape on the site, makes a determination what has historic value and what doesn't, and then this report can be tiered off of as you work through the process. So I'm asking that everyone save their report, and we'll keep a hard copy of the report in the cart so that you don't have to carry the report back and forth each time. We'll have one available for you. But it would be a good idea to save it, so if you're at home and you're getting information regarding this project, you'll have this to fall back on. I just have a couple minor changes I want to add to the report. The first being, of course, the title should say Phase 1 Historic Structure Sites Report. And everybody, we can just kind of handwrite that in. I don't want to kill another tree, so we'll just kind of handwrite that in. And then back on page 62, the last section of 9.6, application of the integrity criteria, where it talks about Table 1, I'd just like to add the brackets in page 59 so that it's easy to refer to that table.
I'm sorry, Mr. Jacobus. Where are you on
Okay,
page 59?
62.
Or 69?
No, page 62.
I'm 62. Excuse me.
62.
Give
The
me
very bottom where it says 9.6 application of the integrity criteria,
Thank you.
you'll see where it says the resources identified in Table 1. I'm suggesting we put a bracket, put page 59 so that you know where to find Table 1 easily.
Thank you.
Then on page 81,
That's page 89 to me. 81, sorry.
okay, page 81.
Yes.
The last paragraph, the last sentence in the last paragraph, two sentences, is analysis of the construction history of the garage is going to be evaluated in the final draft of this report. I believe that Post Hazeltine has analyzed that in this report, so we would strike that line. And then back on page 99, that would be 91 for you, but on page 99, at the very top of the page, similar thing where it sort of talks about the proportions of the main museum complex, et cetera, Table 4, bracket, page 88, unbracket, so that you can find it with ease. And those are things we can just handwrite into a copy to go into the file so we don't have to kill a tree to redraft this report. Staff has read the report. It seems to be quite accurate, very finely detailed. And with that, Mr. Chair, I turn it over to you for your discussion and
Okay.
hopefully acceptance.
I'm going to open up questions. Unless you need to make a presentation. Sure, okay.
Yes.
Introduce
Pamela
yourself.
Post,
Thank you.
co-author of the report. Chair Zuniga and members of the Historic Landmark Commission and members of the Planning Commission. Would just like to get just a synopsis of this rather lengthy tome. Today we're presenting the Phase 1 component of the Historic Structure Sites report for the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History Master Plan. And the focus of the Phase 1 report was to determine what buildings, structures, features, and landscape elements on the museum property were deemed eligible or not eligible as significant historic resources using the criteria established by the City of Santa Barbara. And should be noted, this report is solely confined to assessing significance of surveyed resources within the museum's property. One of the aspects that we determined in the report was a period of significance for the property, and that was between 1922, and that was the building, the first building constructed, which was on the property, which was the Museum of Comparative Oology by the architect Floyd Brewster, to 1945. And this is the end of that formative period of the museum's development, as well as the museum's signature architectural style, Spanish Colonial Revival, which, as a style, ceased in popularity by the end of the 1930s. The level of detail provided in the Phase 1 regarding building descriptions is intended to provide sufficient data to determine architectural style and integrity. And please note that the Phase 2 report, which we are currently preparing, will provide more detailed building descriptions when necessary to evaluate whether specific elements of the proposed master plan would have significant direct or indirect impacts to historic resources. The report identified a number of significant historic resources on the museum property, including the main museum building, including those wings built between 1922 and 1938. And those are listed in Table 7 on page 134. The report also identified a number of residential buildings that were deemed eligible for listing. These included the Director's House at 653 Mission Canyon Road, the Hazard Carriage House and Wall, 2539 to 2559 Puesta del Sol, the Meve House, and its associated cottage at 2565 Puesta del Sol, and the Morehouse House at 2556 Puesta del Sol. And in addition, the former garage at 2758 Las Encinas Road was identified as a significant historic resource, and this was a building that was once associated with the Bernard Hoffman estate, designed by James Osborne Craig, and now, of course, is on museum property, and it's been determined because of its association with James Osborne Craig that it is eligible as a City of Santa Barbara structure of merit. And then finally, the report identified significant cultural landscape extending from Mission Santa Barbara to the museum property, and that's because this area encompasses a range of historic resources built between the late 18th century and the early 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Post. Anything to add, Mr. Hazeltine? No. Okay. Ms. Naylor? Okay. And I'll turn it over to the Commission for questions. Commissioner Schellenberger, did you have any questions about the report? No? Commissioner Lavoie? Okay. Let me ask the others, and then we'll get to you, because I'm sure you're going to be very thorough. Commissioner Sharp?
No questions?
Boucher? Arias? No. No. Okay. Commissioner Murray, if you have questions, let's hear them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Pam and Tim, for the report. I have two questions, and the first question is, I wondered, the 1945 period of significance from 1922 to 1945. I understand the 1922. I didn't quite understand 1945, how you came up with that in the report. I assume there was association with the different presidents, and there's association with the architectural buildings, which will probably be 1922 to 1938, and then the association with the museum leaders. And so what is 1945? I guess because I was looking at the report, and Mr. Mr. Abbey Sturry, he was a leader from 1937 to 1958. So anyway, I wanted to know what the explanation for the 1945 cutoff.
Well, 1945 we determined was, I know it seems like somewhat of an arbitrary date, but we determined that date because this was essentially a period in which there was very little building going on because of World War II, and the deferment of any building projects until after the war. So we found that was an ending date in which it's signified the very early building programs of the museum when it began in 1922, and then 1945, which in essence of the post-war period, which had a different thrust, they had different sort of architectural styles that they were bringing in, and so we felt that was something that fit within the parameters of a period of significance because of that.
The second.
Do you want to add anything, Tim?
Tim Hazeltine, Post Hazeltine Associates. I would just like to add in answering your question It also does refer to the historical development of the museum, and the formative period for the museum's development is really, from the initial sort of idea to found the museum in the late teens through about 1945. And by that period, the museum had sort of reached, it had gone through its formative period. It had developed the structure we see. It had become a regional powerhouse as a natural history museum. And of course, it built on that afterwards, but that formative period really does end basically with the end of World War II.
The second question I have is, I generally agree with the conclusions of the report, but I might as well just get to the heart of the matter. And what I did not find in the report, or at least not convincingly described or analyzed to me, is those two wings that were constructed in 1934. And you basically say that should be included in the landmark boundary. There's the 1981 structural merit boundary, and then there's the two. And I guess I wanted to hear from you your reasoning for including those two wings to add to the boundary of the landmarks.
Yeah.
The reason for including those was they were designed by a prominent architect associated with the formative phase of the museum's development. They're reductive versions of the Spanish colonial revival, more reductive than some of the other wings or perhaps even the original courtyard building. They also are part of that early formative period historically outside of their architecture. So those group of buildings built between 22 and 38, as you noted, all date to the same time period. They were all built in the Spanish colonial revival style, various iterations, not all as elaborate as others. And so from an architectural standpoint, that form of the museum that relates to its historical development as a public institution is tied up, also in the architecture. And so we could not see we could make a good case from a preservation standpoint to remove those two wings simply because they were more plainer in style than, say, Fleischmann Auditorium or the Courtyard Building, because they all build together historically and do represent that early history of the museum, as well as being representative of that architect's work.
Thank you.
The architect was Chester Garjola.
Were those designed by Garjola? Those two, or I think it was
Winslow.
Yeah, I think
Carlton Winslow.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason.
Yeah. Even more so, yeah. I'm sorry, yeah. Carlton Winslow, yeah.
The other part of the report that was a little confusing to me is on page 88, you have that table elements that contribute to the historic character of the building. So if you take, for instance, the local, for instance, on that page 88, the administrative wing, you say north, south, and east elevations are the character defining. And I think that's the part I did not see how I guess I'll have to read the report again. Believe me, I read this report 2 times. And those character defining elements of those elevations, I guess I wanted to have them more pronounced. I guess I just wasn't convinced that the elements of those are so important.
And that's for the Luria.
For the administrative wing and the bird hall, yeah. Anyway, those are just questions, yeah.
I can actually show you, which I'm not sure was included in the report, if I can find it quickly. Here's a plan of that was included. I thought there was an elevation, which I may not have. But for the local birds hall here that projects off the south elevation of the rear of the building, right here, if you were standing in the courtyard, there's actually a gable roof element here, sort of classically, not classical style, but it's a front gable element. it does form part of the architecture of the building. And on these ends, even though they've been encapsulated here, the top portions with what used to be these sort of semicircular arched windows extend along both of these elevations. So we wanted to include that, and of course the rear wing is still open to view. And so even though the lower portion of these elevations is encapsulated on this side by the geology building or geology hall, on this, those elements of those windows, even though they've been covered over, are still there. So we feel that contributes, and actually they're the more striking elements of that building are the arched windows in the gable roof facing towards the courtyard.
You'll see a photograph of that in
Yeah.
our presentation, the lunette
Sure.
windows along
Yeah.
the side. Oh, you'll see a presentation image of that, which shows lunette windows on the side of that elevation.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, Ms. Murray?
No, that's it for now.
Any other commissioners? Any questions? I have a few questions, and then I have a lot of comments, but I'll go through some meatier questions. On page 1 of the report, we're referring to 8 parcels that comprise the property. In staff report, they talk about 7, and in another report, they talk about 8, and in another report, they seem to talk about 6. How many parcels are there?
I can never remember. 8.
Okay. So the report's correct. Thank you. Okay. Give me a minute to find my other question. Just curious on page 25, the paragraph, second complete paragraph starts with Lockwood DeForest was happy at Thatcher. And then he returned to California and attended the University of California. Which one? At that time?
Yeah.
There was only one? Great.
Yeah.
Maybe that just clarified that then.
Sure.
You-
That was it. So it had no Berkeley associated. Okay. Yeah. I wasn't around then. I don't know. Well, how do you know now? Page 33, excuse me, under the Fleischmann Auditorium, the interior of the Fleischmann Auditorium. It's the second complete paragraph. Why address the interior of this building and not the interior of others in this report? Just
I think, honestly, it's the most striking public space that hasn't been, I mean, the Mammals Hall, obviously, we probably could have included that too. I think we were trying to give, because this is an auditorium building, we wanted to give an understanding of what that space looked like, because it is got a wonderful ceiling, as we all know. And so we wanted to give some characterization. But we could certainly, in the
maybe
phase
that's
2.
better left for the phase 2.
In the phase 2, when we go into more detail on each building, we will include interiors also.
Okay. And then on page 42. Oh, I'm sorry, that's a comment. And I can't phrase it in the form of a question.
Okay.
Basically, those were my burning questions. Okay. Do we have any comments from the commissioners? Commissioner Shalom, Commissioner Arias, do you have any comments?
No, I have comments on the staff report, the report by, this report, I have comments on.
Okay, then I need to ask staff, when is it appropriate to make comments on the report that Commissioner Arias is referring to, which is?
The project description of the report. I assume that would come on the next items.
That's the next item. The only thing that we're concerned with at this point is the Phase 1 historic structures report.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Boucher, any comments?
No, not at this point.
Commissioner Sharp?
Not at this time.
Commissioner Lavoie? Commissioner Schallenberger? Okay, Commissioner Murray?
I guess for the Phase 2 report, I am going to be looking at the impacts because the proposal is to remove those wings. And I am going to be looking to how that analysis is going to come out. I'm also going to look for the analysis of the paseos and how the new project is utilizing all that. I am also going to look for an analysis on the size of the new buildings and their spatial relationships. I am also going to look at the address the. You addressed it here, the loop around the site and how that will be. But mostly is those two wings. Because I think that's where the difference between the applicant and the report have, and so I'm going to be looking for detailed, convincing analysis on those. Thank you.
Commissioner Schallenberger.
Just one comment on the summary statement of significance, table 7.
Page?
Page 134.
Thank you.
Just wanted to make sure that my reading was correct, where the structure of merit designation or eligibility is left empty. That's because it's superseded by being eligible for a landmark?
Yes.
Yes.
Any other questions from the commissioners? I have a bunch of questions, and I don't think this venue is necessarily the appropriate place to go through all of the comments. So I don't think I'm really ready to offer approval of this. I think it might be better if I sat down with the authors and went through some of this. I spent a lot of time cross-checking things and noticed several mistakes and things that need to be clarified. For instance, on page 18, you were talking about the property at 653 Puesta del Sol, the Herman Eddy House. I believe that is Mission Canyon Road. That's easily correctable. But I have a lot of markings in here, and I don't want to waste everybody's time going through this, but I know that you are looking for an approval. I don't know what the timing is on that approval, and I'm asking staff if it's okay to sit down with the authors of the report and go through some of these issues point by point. It's a good report, but it's a very complex report, and I think it's essential to get those things ironed out and nailed down before we accept the report, because it's sort of a basis of our decision making.
There's two ways to do this. One would be if the majority of the commission felt that the report is far enough along that they could approve it with comments, meaning that your comments could be, you could sit down with Post Hazeltine and give them your comments. Those comments could be edited into the report. Or if you feel very strongly that those comments need to be addressed prior to your making a recommendation or supporting the acceptance of the report, you could essentially be, I would recommend that you be a subcommittee of 2, you and perhaps Fermina Murray, and sit down with Post Hazeltine and go over your comments, at a venue of your choice, and then come back the next time and we can approve the report.
Commissioner Murray, would you be willing to do that? Do you feel it's necessary? I'm going to defer to you, because a lot of maybe I was focused too much on cross-checking things, but if you feel the report's ready to accept with some minor.
I also would like to work with you, because I guess what I would like to do for the next phase, at least, is to be sure that when you read the report, you understand what's going on this. And I wanted some of those integration. For instance, that demolition map in here, it will be really good if it corresponds with the report, because they're talking about historical buildings by wing. They are talking about, demolition. So I think that will really make it easier for the commissioners to look at the plans and follow the report as they go along. So those are just little technical things that I would be happy to work with.
Okay. So I'm hearing you say that you'd rather defer acceptance of the report until we get those things nailed down.
It's up to the commission. I
Just a
yeah,
minute. Just,
go ahead.
Okay.
Well,
Miss.
Mr. Chair?
I'd suggest tabling the acceptance of the report for 2 weeks. And in that period, coordinate with staff any changes that need to be incorporated into the report and brought back to us at that time, either in draft form or outline form, and then subsequently added into the report.
It sounds like
moved.
a motion. Okay, motion made by Lavoie, second by Boucher, under discussion, and I believe the applicant is dying to.
Well, not dying, but
Okay.
If I can
Quickly.
just, yes, ask if they're non-substantive, which it sounds like the address is non-substantive, though the demolition plan may be, in your opinion, could we have conditional approval contingent upon correction of the non-substantive corrections? And then secondarily, we do have until 2:30. I don't know how many you have.
Yes, you're right.
could I make a comment?
Yes.
If you do have a number, it would be more efficient for us to receive your edits and incorporate them, and then perhaps if you would like to review it after we've incorporated your edits, if you feel there are changes that need to be made and you've penciled them in, we're certainly able to do that without having to actually sit there and you say, well, I think you've misspelled this name here.
Right.
One comment I would like to make is that the Phase 2 document will basically encapsulate this report in a different format. And going back to what Suzette said, if these changes are obviously they're necessary and we need to make them, we can make them if they're not ones that substantively, that do not change the conclusions in the sense that our analysis of what is significant and what is not significant is sound. I would look for a conditional approval contingent on us incorporating your comments and submitting that to staff. And of course, that's the baseline for the Phase 2 report.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there. Did you? Yeah, okay.
Mr. Chair?
Then I'll call the question and we'll see how it flies.
Amendment to the motion,
Okay.
then to amend it to accept the recommendations and conclusions and analysis of the report, and that the edits are merely for clarification.
Okay, so we have a amendment to the motion, and that's to accept the report with the condition that some of the changes be implemented based on two commissioners' input. We have a motion by Lavoie, second by Boucher. Under discussion, Commissioner Arias.
When would we get these changes? Because I am concerned that any report goes forward that has errors in it.
Yeah, that's my concern as well.
It does not serve the public well to have a report that is not accurate.
Well,
The motion stood 2 weeks.
Yeah. Well, it's, okay, 2 weeks, then we would.
2 weeks, but the amendment motion did not
Yeah.
say 2 weeks.
So, Mr.
If
Lavoie,
the
do you want?
amendment motion was just additional language to the original motion, did not change it. So the motion then is for to table the approval for 2 weeks, and in the interim, commissioners to work with staff in order to update and correct any edits, and that the report, its conclusions and recommendations are supportable by the commission. Is that clear?
Okay, that's clear to me. Do you agree with that? Okay, and is staff clear on that motion? Okay, any other discussion?
Yes.
Commissioner Murray?
What I asked for the Phase 2 for them to look at, could that be part of the motion, or is it just going to be comments?
I think it's just going to be comments because we
okay.
haven't seen anything on
Right,
Phase 2. We
exactly.
can't really
Yeah.
comment on
Okay.
it. Okay, so I'm going to call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Schallenberger opposed. The rest in favor? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, staff
Jacobus.
will email you and we'll provide a room in the building for you all to sit down and
Okay,
take care of your issues.
thank you. We are 15 minutes ahead of schedule. I am going to call a recess for 5 minutes. I appreciate all the planning commissioners being here on time and being ready to jump in, but we need to wait at least 10 minutes before an item before we can open that item, since it is a public item. So we are recessed. Commission, and this is the point where it becomes a joint meeting with the Planning Commission. And the first item on the joint meeting agenda is concept review of 2559 Puesta del Sol. This is comments only. The project requires environmental assessment and Planning Commission review. Plans for this project were discussed last on July 21st, 2010 at a joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the Historic Landmarks Commission. Staff have any comments?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, just a couple of brief comments.
And you are?
I am Peter Lawson. I'm the
you.
project planner for the museum master plan. And we received a pre-application for the project probably about 6 weeks ago. And that gave city staff an opportunity to take a look at the whole project and provide a letter back to the applicant with all our comments. So today what I'm going to do is run through a couple of the issue areas that we have, and then I'm going to turn it over to the museum design team, and they'll provide a comprehensive overview of the project coming before you. So the main thing that we really came up with is the way the project is laid out. There is a major oak woodland habitat on site, and the development would definitely have some impacts to that oak woodland habitat. You have both a riparian oak woodland habitat and what they call an upland oak woodland area. Tree replacement from the development and the proposed emergency access would range in the upper 300, 400 range, and it would not entirely be on site, and that provided concern to us. And the other thing is trying to minimize the impacts to the creek. We're looking at maybe a little bit bigger setback than typically on the ordinance. Historic impacts, you've already heard the report, so that could lead to a potential Class 1 impact. We're still working out with the applicant. We're in the pre-application phase right now. We're working with the applicant about the setbacks from an environmental standpoint. What would be appropriate. There will be improvements along Puesta del Sol, turning from a one-way to a two-way, and transportation plan, we're working with them about seeing what kind of additional traffic impacts may be generated with additional development. And what kind of additional staff or visitors may arise from the development. We're looking at an opportunity along Mission Canyon to try and improve the pedestrian and bicycle improvement access along there because of the bridge over Mission Creek provides a pinch point for pedestrian and bicyclists. And then on the residential portion, there'll be a parking modification, and we just want some clarification on how to approach that. Two quick corrections. We had in our staff report that it'd be about 65% of the replacement trees be off-site. Upon further review, it's about 35% being proposed to be planted off-site. Creek setback, the applicant met with us, and they will now provide a revised landscape plan that is in your packet that shows developments such as pathways, road, will be now outside the 25-foot setback. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the applicant. And staff is just looking for feedback from you on anything that concerns you, things we should focus on, of that nature. Thank you.
Mr. Lawson, before you step away from the podium, anything specific you want us to comment on? I mean, really specific? Modification, anything? Can you repeat that if...
Sure. From a source standpoint, I have already heard some comments about your concern on the two wings that are proposed for demolition, and any further comments you might have or want to broaden on that.
Okay.
In terms of the overall development and where it's been located, we want to hear feedback on biological impacts, any concerns for creek impacts. We have had some comments from neighbors concerning over time about events and noise impacts from events, and just share with us any comments on that.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Lawson. We have an applicant. Before you start, Ms. Elledge, I'm going to read the comments that were made on July 21st. I'm going to try and briefly go through them. These are the joint comments by the Planning Commission and the Historic Landmark Commission members. Compatibility. Because the museum is unique, being located within a residential neighborhood, the new development should have a sense of the neighborhood setting. Massing. The commissions were concerned with the massiveness of the proposed buildings and not being broken up similar to the current development. Residential. The McVeigh House is not compatible with the current site plan. If relocated, it will read better as a residence with a street frontage. There should be residential use of both the Carriage House and the McVeigh House. You must include the character of the landscaping, such as the oak trees in the new area. Create a balance between that character and its function. The development plan agreement. If the project is built in phases, it could be conditioned or structured so that certain economic thresholds would have to be reached before work is begun in order to avoid ending up with failed stages of the project for lack of funding. Historic issues. The restoration of historic buildings is much appreciated. Appreciation for the restoration of the Lockwood to Forest Garden was expressed. The museum should move forward with a landmark designation for the original structures after they have been rehabilitated. It would be preferred that the old building be seen by the public first. Continue the use of the historic buildings as exhibit halls as opposed to administration. Biological issues in creek restoration. It is important that the creek and the historic structure relate to each other. Support the proposal to have a better connection to Mission Creek. Creek restoration is a function and can be achieved within varying setbacks. Recommended presenting this project to the Creeks Committee. Reduce the paving and increase permeability, especially in the parking lot. Solar panels. New development should incorporate solar panels, and they should be within character. Transportation issues. Supported reconfiguring Puesta del Sol to provide the direct entrance to the museum. If Puesta del Sol becomes a two-way road, applicant needs to carefully consider the impact of the new left turn pocket on Mission Canyon. Consider mass transit, such as electric shuttles, to reduce automobiles within the project area. Connect to downtown. Emergency access issues. The most natural paving surface would be preferred. Supported turf block for the driveway and asked that the fire department consider alternative paving. Look into the Living Desert as an example with its use of paving in the parking lot. And lastly, part of the design consideration should include sheltering in case of a wildland fire. Ms. Elledge, thank you for your patience.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Suzanne Elledge, representing the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History.
Welcome.
In addition to my... Am I not on? Does that sound better?
That's better.
In addition to my brief opening remarks, Dr. Carl Hutterer, the Executive Director of the museum, will discuss the need for and the purpose of the master plan. And then Walter Schacht of Schacht Aslani Architects will present the project in detail. Suzette Naylor of Thompson Naylor Architects will wrap up with concluding remarks. We also have team members available today if there are questions during your deliberations. Post Hazeltine is staying over for this part of the hearing. We also have Susan Banata, our landscape architect here, and Mark De La Garza, our biologist. Because of the scope and the complexity of the museum's master plan, our presentation takes about 1 hour, which is certainly longer than is typical. But this is not a typical project. It's not a typical site. And please put your faith in my assurance that to fully understand the master plan, you need, and I believe you will appreciate ultimately, the time that you spend in allowing us to share with you a summary of the museum's visionary objectives. What we have learned about the site to date and the master plan concept that we have developed. We've attempted to boil it down to be as concise as possible, but I urge you to all get comfortable. Now, what I would like to share with you as we begin this presentation this afternoon is just how extraordinary this project is. While your commissions frequently have to grapple with difficult decisions and are often asked to consider and balance multiple issues when projects come before you, this particular application and this specific project site and this visionary 21st century master plan requires you, challenges you, and I hope inspires you to think differently, more broadly, and perhaps even use a new method, a new measure by which to evaluate the project. And here's why. Most of the significant projects that you review are located on sites that are primarily urban sites. In contrast, the museum site is located in a high fire hazard area, has oak woodlands, riparian woodlands, Mission Creek running through it, more than 1,000 trees, the vast majority of which are native trees, historic structures, and is home to one of the oldest, most beloved cultural, scientific, and educational institutions, nonprofit institutions, in our community. In fact, for nearly 100 years, the museum has lived and evolved on this site. A city treasure serving thousands of people annually, it is designated as a community priority and economic development project, and along with several other institutional and quasi-public uses, operates as a conditional use in a residential zone and neighborhood. That's pretty unusual, all of that put together. In my 25 years of land use planning, the museum's master plan is one of the most meaningful and complex projects that I have had the privilege to work on. What the museum did as it embarked upon this intensive planning effort was set the example for all of us, the team, the community, city staff, and you as decision makers, to think innovatively and recognize the importance of an integrative planning approach to this complex undertaking, and to be mindful of this as we all move ahead and contribute to the development of the final master plan. The materials we submitted to the city as part of our pre-application package that you've now had the opportunity to review, and we sincerely thank you for the time it took to go through all of those documents. It's quite voluminous. These documents contain all of the usual and required statistics about site acreage, floor area, building heights, earthwork quantities, and so on. And there are more reports to come, more facts and more figures. We've focused up till now more on the physical side of the master plan, but there will be reports coming that have to do with fire evacuation and construction mitigation programs. Many of us have particular areas of interest, or we may be concerned about a particular project statistic, but the scope of this project requires us all not to focus on one individual puzzle piece, but to view in the context of the whole puzzle how the pieces fit together, integrative planning. So, for example, historic structures must be seen in the shared context of necessary fire protection, the removal of individual trees in the context of comprehensive habitat restoration, and so on, throughout all issue areas and project components. An open-mindedness is called for, a willingness to think beyond a series of statistics or a particular issue area to see an inspired vision for the museum of the future. This master plan is as much about the site as it is about the buildings, as much about the sustainable future, as much about a sustainable future and leading by example as it is about preserving what is best about its historic legacy. And ultimately, this project is as much about continuing to serve our community with meaningful and relevant programming as it is about respectfully and compatibly operating within its neighborhood context. So thank you. I'd like to introduce Dr. Carl Hederer now.
Chairs and members of the two commissions, I wish I had Suzanne's gift of language, but you'll have to do with me for the next few minutes. My name is Carl Hutter. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, and I've had the really great privilege to be in that position for 11 years, and it's the best job I've had in my entire life. You will hear today a lot about buildings and square footage and roads and site issues and so forth. And I would like to start out with an assertion by saying it's not about buildings. It's about what the museum is and what it does, what it stands for, what it means for the community. The buildings are nothing but instrumentalities. They're tools for what we do. And obviously one of those tools is sharp and as well crafted as they can possibly be in order to make us effective in what we do. But it's for that reason that in 2007 we commenced an intensive and sustained planning effort which started with strategic planning at first, in which we tried to figure out what we are, what we do, what we stand for, and what we mean for the community in our second century of our existence. And incidentally, as part of this planning, we began with 100 community interviews to see what our community members think about us and what they expect. And then we commenced to define 3 guiding principles that have been truly our lodestar ever since then for everything we do, and will continue to be that. And those 3 guiding principles are in front of you in their headlines only: inspiring awe for nature, and the thirst for discovery, promoting sustainability, and connecting our community. And what they really mean in a nutshell is that it's about nature. Our focus is on nature and the future of our natural environments, and how we as human beings and as a community relate to it in a very rapidly changing and challenging world. This kind of set of guiding principles and our mission we implement in 4 broad programmatic areas. The first one is creating new knowledge about nature. It is very troublesome, indeed it's shameful, and it is very threatening how little we truly know about our natural environments, how shallow our knowledge is. It is amazing. We maintain a staff of 14 full-time scientists who every year define, discover, and describe dozens of new species of living things. They help us understand how we can reconstruct and recover deeply damaged environments. They help us understand strange phenomena that occur in our natural world on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. The knowledge we generate in our scientific work, we apply directly in our educational programs, and we maintain a rich set of educational programs through every age group, from toddlers through senior citizens. But our our strongest focus is on the young generations. What we want to do is we want to advance scientific literacy among our young people as an insurance of their future and the future economic health of our community in an increasingly globalized and increasingly competitive world. This alone will help us to sustain ourselves. We also apply this knowledge in thinking about how we can sustain the natural world that in turn sustains us. No matter how advanced our technology is, it is still the natural world that sustains us. And we all know, and we know from our scientific world, that the natural systems that we rely on are in deep, deep trouble and facing an incurable crisis. We want to be leaders in a common effort to advance sustainability for the long term. And finally, while it's all about nature, ultimately it's not really about nature, because nature will truly take care of itself, and it has done that for millions of years. It's really about us in the end. We need to be able to survive, and we need nature to help us survive. And so we are also really focused on strengthening the community. For decades we have been an institution that has brought the community together to celebrate, to mourn, to discuss, to debate. And by doing so, we have really helped to strengthen the fabric of our community, which is an essential precondition for just about everything else. After 95 years, we are very aware that the natural world that we interpret and study has changed drastically. The community we serve has changed drastically. And the museums we represent have changed drastically. And we have to come to grips with that. We are very fortunate to have as a support for our work 4 very important major strengths. One of them is the fact that we are located in the midst of an absolutely drop-dead gorgeous piece of nature. Not only up at Mission Canyon, but also down on Stearns Wharf with our Sea Center. And this is a strength that very few other museums, if any, can bring to the table the way we can. Oops, I'm sorry. Also, we are blessed with some buildings that are among the jewels of Santa Barbara's historic architectural legacy. That's a great strength. Over the decades, we have not been one of those grand natural history museums with huge buildings that swallow people up inside, but we have made a real specialty of maintaining an intimate experience in a small-scale institution. And finally, we have been able so far, up until now, to maintain up on the Mission Canyon campus a unity of purpose among our different programs, collections and the research, education, the exhibits and the public programs, and thereby, by doing so, being able to sustain or to gain some synergy among those programs, and therefore really improving our impact. There are, however, also a number of challenges, and those challenges are quite serious, and I want to quickly run through them. The first one is that with the campus, it has kind of accreted, I would say, over decades. We are really challenged in the space we have. The space is not only inadequate for virtually any of the programs, it's very badly organized, and it's in many cases very poor in quality. It is simply no longer serves the purposes that we need it to serve. Whether this be in our collections, in our research, in our educational programs, in the way we sustain the organization, where we have administration and workshops for exhibits and so forth scattered hither and yon across the whole site, and making work difficult for us. We also make it difficult for our visitors. People get confused coming to us. They get further confused once they're on the campus. Here's a little map on how things look like once people are on the campus. They get turned around and turned around and turned around again. Visitors coming to us in wheelchairs have a really difficult time getting around, as you probably know. And finally, our buildings, as charming as they are, have one great disadvantage in the current configuration. They cut us off from nature rather than leading us to it. And in the site that we have that we're so proud of, this is really a sin. The site itself, the environment and the ecology of the site is challenged. And over the decades, I know we have done things we should not have done, and we want to correct. We are anxious, eager to correct. Every year during the winter rains, huge amounts of stormwater rush down Mission Canyon, Presto del Sol, and run across our campus and dump into Mission Creek untreated. Mission Creek, a habitat for steelhead. Currently, there's steelhead in it. We ourselves, with our buildings and the paving we've done, we have crowded the creek right up to the creek bank. We should not have happened. We want to correct that. Many decades ago, nobody knows when it happened, the creek retaining wall was built. And that retaining wall has been undercut and is in danger of collapsing at some point in the future. We don't know when, but it will collapse. We have been assured by the engineers. So we need to take care of that. During the Hesida fire, we have become painfully and frighteningly aware of how incredibly bad our fire protection is. Protection for resources that are literally, absolutely, utterly irreplaceable. And finally, we are so proud of our site, of our outdoor spaces, and we would like to use it more effectively for educational purposes, but we are challenged by the way things are currently configured. The buildings themselves, finally, have multiple problems. Many of our buildings are beyond their natural life expectancy. They're riddled with termites and mold and dry rot. None of them comply, or almost none of them comply with current code, seismic or otherwise. Almost none of them comply with current museum standards. And of course, they're not sustainable from a purely energy efficiency point of view. In fact, they're a model of unsustainability. I will want to share something. Having talked about museum standards, I want to share something this morning. We just went through the decennial process of reaccreditation by the American Association of Museums, and this morning I got a call from the chair of the Accreditation Commission saying that we are granted accreditation again. And that was a great moment of joy. But I also learned that the only reason why we squeezed through was because we are in the middle of master planning. Were it not for that, we would not have gotten reaccredited because of the state of our buildings. Here's a picture of how paving and pests are impacting our campus and our buildings. But I will now turn things over to our architect, one of our architects, Walter Schacht, to talk about the vision of the future. Thank you very much.
Mr. Schacht, you have approximately 20 minutes.
Okay, we'll move quickly. Thank you. Good afternoon. We're going to move quickly through showing you where we are with the planning. I'm going to start by reprising what we presented to the two commissions a year ago tomorrow, just because the initial planning we presented last year is so fundamental to all the detailed planning we've done since then. But before I get into it, I want to say that there are three great resources on this site today. There's the resources of the historic buildings, there's the resources of the environment, the creek, the woodlands, and the resource of the cultural institution. And we've already heard in terms of the historic structures and sites report, in terms of the city's initial comments on the PRT, in terms of the director's discussion of the museum, that there are significant issues related to each one of these three resources. The goal of this project is to bring these three resources into harmony with each other and to actually improve the state of affairs and the long-term sustainability and conservation of each of the three. But to get there is not an easy roll of the dice, and I think that that's an important consideration. So, a year ago, we talked to you about the fact that there's 3 CUPs on the site, that we want to replace them with a single conditional use permit, that the baseline levels of activity, attendance, hours, operation, all of the basic operational conditions of the CUP or the CUPs that are currently in place are what the museum would seek to extend in the future, not looking to expand upon that. We also talked about the fact that a portion of the museum's property is in the county and a portion is in the city, and we think it's a good idea that all this be pulled together under one jurisdiction, that being the city of Santa Barbara. The existing museum is 82,000 square feet. When we did the programming, the wish list took us almost to 150,000 square feet. We don't believe that that would fit on the site. We don't believe it's affordable. A year ago, we showed you a program of about 123,000 square feet. We've actually squeezed it down a little bit more since then, so currently we're proposing 121,000 square feet. I would say I'd like to make a correction to one figure that was in the city staff's PowerPoint, and that is that we're adding less than 40,000 square feet. The 57,000 square feet that were mentioned, I believe, is a reference to the Measure E allocation. It's not actually where we are today. Expansion of the museum is in 3 basic categories. We have a modest expansion of space for public use. There's additional gallery space. There's a little bit more visitor services space. The classrooms are a little bit larger. There's a modest increase of space for the behind-the-scenes area. Those include the administrative offices, the collections and research center, the shops, loading facilities. The majority, or the largest area of increase in space, I should say, is in support space. Restrooms, mechanical rooms, electrical rooms. So in order to create contemporary sustainable buildings, we need buildings that actually work with the way we construct public facilities today. That isn't likely to increase use on the site because those areas are not occupied by people or used by people. Here's a picture of the site as it stands today. Here's the existing boundary line between the city and the county. Museum, as you know, is on 2 pieces of land separated by Puesta del Sol. Here's an analysis of the existing conditions on site that we'd like to deal with. Circulation takes visitors, school buses, deliveries, trucks, off Mission Canyon Road through the residential neighborhood and sort of brings them in back way around to the parking lot. It's one issue. Another issue is the fact that over time the buildings as they have developed over the site, have invaded this blue area, which represents the creek, and the 25 and 50-foot setbacks, which are an important part of the riparian corridor. The areas that are shaded in brown along here are the structures that are currently designated as structures of merit by the city. The shading with the light cross hatching are those structures which are recommended by our historians in the report that you just received and discussed earlier this afternoon to be added as structures of merit. And then the dark hatched areas are buildings that are on the site which are not considered to be structures of merit. The pink areas describe those areas that have been developed significantly over time, and although there are trees and other kinds of development in there, really are no longer part of an integrated natural resource, and we're going to see more about this later. And then the green areas represent areas in which there is more significant tree growth and woodlands. So, the overarching concept is this: to resolve the service and access problem by adding a left turn lane along Puesto del Sol so that visitors and service can directly access the museum and not have to go through the neighborhood. And this would indeed allow you to see the historic buildings first as you come onto the site. The next big concept is to remove all the buildings that are not currently designated as structures of merit. This would remove paving and structures that are in the riparian corridor and in the environmental setbacks, and it's the important first step to the restoration of the site. It would also allow us to get access all the way around the site and buildings, which would give us the ability to fight fires both in the woodlands as well as in and around the buildings. So the restoration of the riparian corridor is part of this plan. We also propose to improve, and you'll see this in more detail, and conserve the oak woodlands. So, as I said at the beginning, here we're already seeing a commitment to the historic resources and a commitment to the environment of the site. And then finally, there's inadequate stormwater management, mostly from water that comes from off-site. We've got water coming down Puesto del Sol. We've got stormwater coming in off of Mission Canyon Road. We propose to collect, slow, detain, and treat that water as part of our project. So if we make those basic moves to reorganize the site, and again, in respect to the resource of the environment of the buildings and also in respect to providing community benefit, then we have to find a place for replacement development for the structures that come down and for the additional 40,000 square feet that we're looking to add. And the idea is to take the area where McVeigh House is, which has been scarred by development over the years, and put the development there. This is taking all of the non-designated buildings, currently non-designated buildings, and just showing what the footprint would be if we moved the existing footprint over there and McVeigh House across the street. And this is the footprint that we showed you a year ago, which is on the order of scale of reassembling the current parts. And this is the plan that you saw a year ago. So we've done a lot of study, a lot of technical work since we were here last year. I'm just going to really touch on two things that we've studied in detail before I show you where the plans are today. We've looked to the past. We're going to talk about where we've looked in terms of precedents for design, and we've looked to the future. And we've made a significant investigation and determination of what we can do in terms of physical sustainability for the buildings on the site. We've got 5 main areas of focus: water conservation, material resource conservation, carbon footprint reduction, for which we think we can get to net zero with energy, which would be a significant thing to do and a model for the community, and then education and quality of place are also part of a sustainable agenda. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here in respect to the limits of time, but we're doing a lot of water conservation, starting with the stormwater program I talked about, serious focus on natural drainage systems. The comments that Commissioner Sudig read about pervious paving have been taken to heart. We've got pervious paving throughout the site. We're repaving the existing parking lot, so that's pervious. Basically, almost all of the paving that's in the site plan now is pervious. We're talking about green roofs on the new buildings as part of that systems, and cisterns and water reuse. Won't go into a lot of detail about material resource conservation, except that we'll follow best practices there. We're looking at the United States Green Building Council's red list as a point of departure for that. Huge strides forward with carbon footprint reduction. The basic planning has been focused on daylighted harvesting. You'll see that we've got solar arrays on all the new buildings. We're meeting with geothermal specialists this week. We think that we can put a geothermal well field in the parking lot. If we can combine the solar arrays and a geothermal well field and some of the strategies listed here, such as heat recovery and passive cooling, we believe that we can get to net zero on the energy side, which would be, again, a model for the community and a model for the museum and research community, because it's very hard to get to net zero when you have science labs. And then there are things the museum can do for the community as an educational facility to make the sustainable strategies evident. And then, as important as anything else, and it's tied to your own emerging sense of yourself as a city and the proposed general plan, all these strategies tie into a larger notion of what sustainability is about in terms of the community itself. We've also spent a lot of time looking at the history of our site, the history of Spanish colonial revival design in Santa Barbara, and I had the opportunity to spend time in the White Cities of Andalusia and really get my head around what we're trying to do with the new buildings and their relationship to the historic buildings, the site, and the community. So here is the original core building, the Museum of Comparative Oology. Very simple, very straightforward. Very idealistic in a way, with this enclosed courtyard in which only the sky is seen. You see on the right here that this original building had a very direct link to the creek in nature. This door took you out there. That relationship's been cut off by development over time. Here's Carlton Winslow's plan that shows the first set of additions to the core building. Very interesting to us that this line is marked as the top of creek here. That's what our current surveyed assumed top of creek is. As we know, there's been intrusions into the creek by retaining walls all along this length. And although we can't say for sure, we believe that this indicates that those retaining walls and that intrusion of the creek were built in order to accommodate Lurie and Admin being perched out here. Wouldn't have been physically possible to put them there. These are the two buildings that we're talking about demolishing, which may be designated structures of merit. So after this drawing was drawn, for better or for worse, the museum began to tinker with the natural environment of the site. And we believe that historic setting of the site is as important culturally as the buildings themselves. A perspective of the Mammal Hall, some of the other additions that Carlton Winslow did, some of the interiors which we hope to be able to rehabilitate, a little fragment of a succulent garden which is historic and which we may believe that it's possible that Lockwood DeForest designed behind the library. We're going to try and preserve that. The original Botany Hall, which is now called the Cartwright Hall. So we've been looking very, very closely at our own buildings and admiring sort of their rustic simplicity. I would say in the history of development of the Spanish colonial revival style in Santa Barbara, one might call them as being from the Doric era. They're really early, they're really simple, they're really unadorned. And this is a very telling photograph. Here's the original core building in that door I showed you. Here's Gould Indian Hall. Here's Lurie. I think Suzette referred to this photograph earlier in the earlier presentation. But here are those buildings, and here's the work to actually tear out the landscape of the creek bank. There was a natural flow of topography all the way down to the creek at the time this first set of buildings were erected. And all the subsequent buildings have taken that away. So we've looked at the EPV guidelines. We've looked at civic buildings done by the architect of the original core building, the original courtyard building. Been looking at Riviera Park. We've been studying the progenitors of the style, and as I said, we've been to Andalusia. So these are all quotes from the guidelines. I made a very interesting discovery. Here's the Daily News building. Here's Ronda in Andalusia. So I think I stumbled across a building that perhaps George Washington Smith had stumbled across in his travels. There's certainly a parallel there. Here's Ronda again on its own dramatic creek. And we were really taken again by the simplicity, the directness, the clarity of style of the buildings that influenced the architects who developed the style here in Santa Barbara. Okay, so here's where we are today. The site plans that you see and the building plans integrate the work that's been done by Susan Van Atta's office. So the landscape plans and the architectural plans have been composited and brought together. Here are the rehabilitated historic core buildings, again, the ones currently designated as structures of merit. Here's McVeigh House moved across the street. Here's the new complex of buildings. There's an outdoor space, courtyard, astronomy courtyard in between new and old that ties them together. It's a whole series of paseos. Now, the big difference, we'll see this as we go through, the big difference between what we presented a year ago and what we're showing today is that we had two large masses of building, a north building and a south building a year ago. Below grade, we still have two large masses of buildings, but above grade, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 separate pavilions with paseos and courtyards in between them. And this has been our effort to get a scale relationship between new and old. The red lines on the drawings represent the pertinent setbacks. The closest red lines in are the surveyed top of creek. The creek actually goes in further than that now, obviously, because of the retaining wall. But if the creek bank were to return to its angle of repose, that's where the surveyor says it would be. The next lines out are the 25-foot setback. The ordinance says that no development of any type can occur between 0, top of creek, and 25 feet. And then between 25 and 50 feet, that's the next setback. All of our buildings are outside of that 50-foot setback. We do have pedestrian routes and emergency access in that 25 to 50-foot setback, which is allowed by the ordinance. This is, I'm going to go into a lot of detail again because of constraints of time. We can come back to this or make these materials available. This is the organization of outdoor spaces in the new site, tying new and old together. And then Carl showed in his presentation all those little red bug lines. These are the paseos and line of movement that tie together movement east and west, north and south on the new site. So they make it possible for people to get around. It makes the site universally accessible. But it also fits the tradition of the Hispanic tradition in terms of outdoor spaces being as predominant or more predominant than buildings themselves in organizing a site. These are the footprints of the existing building, to scale in relationship. We're just not showing all the site topography and the roads. The dark orange are buildings that will remain. McVeigh is remaining, although it's moving across the street to join the other residences. Now, here is the depiction of the buildings remaining, and in the slate color, the slate blue or gray, you're seeing the lower level of both new buildings. So in terms of total footprint, there is 23% growth over the existing footprint of the site. But this slide shows those 6 pavilions that I referred to. So these are the buildings that are all visible on the upper level. And in terms of the perception, there's only 6% growth. I'm going to go back quickly in terms of the scale issue. Right now, the largest contiguous footprint on the site, number 11, are all these buildings that have been tied together as the museum is built over time. As a 22,000 square foot footprint. The next largest footprint is the Collections and Research Center. That's over 17,000 square feet. That's the current site. In the new configuration, no building volume is that large. So the core buildings are back to their original scale, and now the largest volumes we have is the combination of the permanent galleries and the Naturalist Center, which is almost 14,000 square feet. This is the state of affairs today. This is an aerial photograph. I think it's very telling. Here's our complex. Here's the Mission. Here's St. Anthony's. It is true that we're in a residential neighborhood, that we're on the north side of the creek, but I think it's apparent visually that our institutional scale, quality of the buildings, bears a relationship to the scale of these other buildings. What's remarkable is these buildings are all organized around open spaces. And again, the open spaces are as important as the volumes in terms of the composition of the institutions. Here, we're just this huge amalgamated, stuck together. There are little spaces between some of the buildings, but we're a big box version. It may seem quaint, but it has quite an impact on the landscape. Here's what's proposed, and I think it's quite different in scale. So here are the rehabilitated historic buildings, the new buildings with their PVs and green roofs, permeable paving in the parking lot, pervious paving all along the access on the creek side, and then a real restoration of the riparian corridor in the oak woodland. I think if I'll say for myself, I won't say for you, if you ask me which of these complexes for the museum is more in keeping with the character of the other institutions which represent the heritage of the community, I think we're getting closer here with what we have, or what we're proposing, than with what we have today. So this is the site plan taken at ground level so that we can see the buildings. Again, this textured brown area shows all the pervious paving. How are we doing on time?
You have about 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'm not going to go through all the details. You'll know that we have these as exhibits, and we can come back and discuss them with you. This shows the detailed planning for the improvements, the left-hand turn lane at Puesta del Sol, how we're dealing with buses, how we're dealing with traffic in the community. This zooms us in a little bit closer. We enter through an outdoor pavilion into a common courtyard that ties the west side of Fleischmann to our new complex. We've got visitor services, the store, restrooms, planetarium here, changing exhibitions here. Perhaps the most important new initiative in terms of the museum's mission to connect education, research, and the site to its exhibit programs is the Naturalist Center, which is right here. This is our visual focal point as we come in, and this is where you get to see through the building, see the site, and this is where the scientists at the museum interact with visitors and help them understand the world they live in. We have a new permanent exhibit gallery here, an education building that's perched out over a view of the creek, Library and Maximus, and the administrative offices back here. And then here we see Fleischmann and the rest of the buildings, the carriage houses, all the way out to the right. And again, I'd ask you to observe that all of our buildings are north of the 50-foot setback, and the loop emergency service area is right through here. The only place that it deviates from being in the 25-foot setback is where we sweep it around to avoid this little fragment garden, which is on the south side of the library and which we think has historic value. So these are the lower levels, the shops, the Collections and Research Center, mostly below grade. This is the lower level of Fleischmann, all below grade. This zooms us in. I won't go through this now. We can come back to it if you would like to. This does show in detail top of creek, 25 feet, 50 feet, this one point at which we sweep around in order to save this little fragment of garden. Here's some early perspectives. Please be mindful of the fact that we're early in schematic design. We're beginning to develop a notion about the character of the buildings, but we're not making a complete design proposal today. We're really talking about the big picture, but this is looking down Puesta del Sol towards the entry. As I said, it's an open-air pavilion that you come into. See the Tower of St. Anthony's. Here's the store on the right. This is in the astronomy courtyard. See the changing exhibits gallery, and there's the entry to the administrative offices down there. So we're working with a language that we believe is directly drawn from the precedents that we showed you of the museum, the style within the city, and the historic precedent of Andalusia. This is the library in Maximus looking across to St. Anthony's. And this is, I'm going to jump forward here. This is a picture that Carl showed you earlier. This is almost the same viewpoint. This is looking down the creek now, the paving and the blank walls. This is what we would like to have. And so again, when we talk about the impact of the project, this one tells us something about our commitment to the riparian corridor, and it tells us something about our commitment to the historic buildings. The elevations, here's the existing complex, the new complex. You can barely see it, but the red line describes the height limit. We remain underneath the height limit. Fleischmann remains the tallest volume on the site. And this is an elevation of what we think the restored south elevation of the historic buildings, the legacy buildings, will be based on the information we have. We have pretty good information about what those buildings would have looked like in order to do the rehabilitation. Okay. I'm going to have to go through this quickly. There's a lot of detailed information in here, but let me just say that in my experience working on cultural projects and public projects, which is what my career is as a professional, this project is quite amazing in terms of its attempt to reach out and tie the community, the institution, the site, and the historic buildings together. But more than that,
I will give you an extra 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. But more than that, there's a uniqueness about this project, which, if it was executed along the lines that we're discussing here, would make it an institution that represents Santa Barbara in a way that would be different than any other natural history museum in the world, and that is the connection between the buildings, the site, the programs, the site, and the community and the site. Natural history museums are generally urban institutions. They're downtown. You experience nature inside of a closed box. The odd situation we have here today is we go out to nature and we experience it inside of a closed box. But executed along the lines, the general lines we're talking about, this would be a singular institution. And I think it would be a benefit to everybody. Okay, I want to talk specifically about some of these issues as to how we're creating balance between the environment and the buildings. So, first of all, in looking at the existing conditions and talking about the transformation, we have to understand that the woodland and the riparian corridor is severely deteriorated. You see that in some of the images. You'll see some more. The entire area was clear-cut for agriculture in the late 19th century, actually maybe in the early 19th century. We've got buildings and paving in the environmental setbacks. We have a degraded understory and habitat. We hope to restore that habitat, not remove it. And there's invasive species of plants and trees. We believe strongly that there's going to be a net gain for the environmental conditions in terms of quality and quantity. We believe strongly that while there may be short-term impacts, the long-term benefits are huge and vastly outweigh the short-term impacts. So we're going to increase the total amount of oak woodlands. We're going to increase the oak and sycamore riparian woodlands. And the museum is committed through an instrument that's yet to be determined to essentially a covenant or other means to basically commit itself to the long-term conservation and maintenance of these areas that are restored to the benefit of the community. So these numbers we've called by taking a look at our biological resources plan. When we look at oak woodland, we're impacting 14/10 of an acre. We're restoring almost 3/4 of an acre. So we are increasing the amount of oak woodland on site by over 26,000 square feet. There's 1/10 of an acre of oak sycamore riparian woodlands impacted. We're going to convert areas that are currently building and paving into riparian woodland. So there's going to be a net gain of over 5,000 square feet of riparian woodland. There are going to be impacts to trees. We have a very straightforward dilemma. We've built buildings where we should have trees, and we think that there are trees where we should have buildings. If we want to get back to the creek, we've got to take the monopoly pieces and move them. There's no way around that. So there are going to be impacts. But the bioresources report, and this is a quote, states, the habitat restoration plan that will be undertaken by the museum will more than offset the impacts of the project and result in a larger, enhanced, and biologically superior oak woodland and oak and sycamore riparian woodland habitat. And the arborist, Bill Spiewak, says in his report, with phased development, and we didn't discuss it today, but we presented last year, we talked about the fact that due to the size of the project, the costs, We intend to phase it over time. With phased development, tree protection measures, and mitigation planting, there will be no net loss of trees or canopy cover. This is an aerial that's been treated to show the state of trees and plantings on the site. The aqua blue color represents the oak, sycamore, riparian woodland. The light green represents the oak woodland. The pink represents actually invasive species. The purple represents ornamentals. And these little patches represent areas in which there's, due to previous development on the site, just sort of little grassland sitting in here. So it's a patchwork quilt. This represents what the plan would do for the site, which is the contiguous organization of the riparian corridor and the oak woodlands. And as I said before, the museum is making an affirmative statement that it will commit itself through a legal and binding process to conserving these amenities in perpetuity as part of the project.
With all due respect, if you could wrap it up.
Okay. Really briefly, this is what the landscape looked like in '53. You can see how much of the area was clear cut. I know that we appreciate the oak trees that are out there today, but they've all grown up as volunteers. The ground plane remains scarred from the earlier development. We're talking about restoring habitat because without the understory, habitat can't really establish itself here. Over on the left, we see what's happening with invasive species and ivy taking the trees. This is not on our site, but this is a Santa Barbara project. We're talking about restoring that understory and restoring the habitat. So I think we're about down to the end here. I won't go into detail other than to show you that we're reducing impervious surface on site by 38%. We're reducing impervious surfaces in the creek back by 78%. The only reason we have a little bit there is to save that historic garden. I won't stop and go on Illyria admin. I'll wait for a question on that. This is basically what we presented, other than to show you that basically these buildings are hanging into the setback, and if and when, and it's mostly when, that creek bank wall fails, there won't be any creek on either side. They'll be all the way into the creek. McVeigh House being moved. I'm going to turn it over to Suzette.
You may. I do want to respect the public and their comment. They have been very patient. We have about 10 speakers. So with that, I will give you 2 minutes, Ms. Naylor.
When she's getting up, would you also acknowledge the letters that were sent to us?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll cut out the whole first paragraph here. We're very grateful to have the benefit of the Joint Commissions. I can't tell you how much we appreciate this, because we think it acknowledges the complexity of this project, and I think it also acknowledges, I hope, our shared belief that the past and the future of this museum are inextricably connected to this community and interwoven in a very strong way. We're very much in alignment with the general plan update and the sustainability framework, which expands the scope of planning issues beyond jurisdictions. You know, all general plans require that each and every element be equal and internally consistent. Different policies must be balanced and reconciled, such that no policy conflicts can exist. So it's a clear guide for decision makers and for applicants alike. But for a particularly complex project like this, where a balance must be struck between seemingly conflicting policies and standards, then it makes sense to step back and look at the goals and objectives. You know, the concept of sustainability, as we all know, started with the ecological sciences and describes systems that thrive in a dynamic balance and are specific to their place. In any plan, general or master, a principle is the underlying assumption or fundamental rule that guides plan policies, standards, and implementation measures. And principles are based on things like community values, planning objectives, planning doctrine, and current technology. One principle that we tried to apply to this is the pursuit of something called resiliency in sustainable talk. As a quality, it allows an element like a tree to bounce back from a fire. or for a school system to absorb the long-term impact of demographic changes. When we're talking about balance, I know sometimes the image of balanced scales come to mind, and if we were to extend that metaphor, I think we should all ask ourselves, how do we calibrate those scales? How do we assign a weight to each item that we put in those scales? I would like to suggest that pursuit of resiliency be considered as a possible principle when you calibrate your scales, or how something contributes to resiliency when you assign a weight to that element. I would also hope that that element always be considered and weighted in the context of the system or systems in which it plays a viable and interactive role. Each element ideally is weighted as a part of a balance of not just interdependent, but interactive support systems. The more these systems interact, the more they increase resilience. The more they interact with other systems and support, there's more resilience. The more resilience, the more stability. The more stability, the more balance, and the more that dynamic balance can thrive. Does the removal of Luria and admin create a precarious state for the historicity of this museum? And how does that weigh in the balance of the museum rehabilitated, reinvigorated, and reintegrated with this site? And that resilience being reinforced by access to fire protection. How do we define stewardship of historic resources? Does the removal of X number of trees scattered throughout the site create a precarious state for a woodland that's defined minimally by 10% canopy cover? And how does that weigh in the balance of the restoration of an oak woodland defined by a healthy understory and contiguous habitat? This museum cannot remain static. It's been in a holding pattern that's crippling. It's becoming outmoded while standing in place. It needs to evolve as an institution. It wants to evolve with this site and with this community. And we want to keep explaining to those children that Chad is not a dinosaur skeleton, which they do think sometimes. It's a whale. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Naylor. Does that conclude your presentation? It better. No, just kidding. Okay, I am going to open public comment, and I'm going to recognize 3 letters we received as a commission, and then the first member of the public will be Richard Solomon. So, Mr. Solomon, if you could get yourself ready. We received a letter from Mr. Dennis Allen in support of the project. We received a letter from Lauren Carey with some concerns. 2 of the main concerns is noise, and second is food and concession plans. Then we received a letter with concerns from Richard Solomon and Jana Zimmer, and basically that had to do with fire evacuation, circulation, construction noise, noise impacts, operating noise impacts, and they want to strike a balance with the museum and their project. So with that, I will go to Mr. Solomon. Mr. Solomon, you have a total of 3 minutes.
I won't need that much. First, thanks to staff for distributing those letters. That's a nice service to provide via email. I appreciate it. We just have 7 requests. That's all. We understand legally the Planning Commission side of this joint meeting can't require the museum to do anything since it's conceptual review. We're not talking about legally enforceable requests. But we'd like for the Planning Commission to use its good offices to request the museum to include 7 things in its project application, which it's not yet submitted, which it's working on. Our view is that when when applications are actually filed, it does very, very good. And Suzanne Elledge and I, we're on the same page on this. We've been having conversations with the applicant. This is not a hostile relationship at all. We hope it continues in that vein. That if the project application contained the mitigation measures the museum is prepared to put into place, that goes a long way to satisfying the neighbors, to allaying concerns. And we live in 2640 Los Encinas Lane, which is about as close as you can get to the project, to the master plan as possible to get. And so the concerns are basically stated in the letter, and I'm just now going to repeat them in summary form and then stop. The first is to ask the applicant to put in its project application its willingness to coordinate all of its mitigation measures with the Mission Canyon Community Plan. Right now, there is no coordination. We think that's a grave mistake, and we ask that this project be the one that starts that process, or at least engages in that process. I'm not sure what form that will take, but that they commit themselves to try and coordinate with that plan. With respect to fire evacuation, we were disturbed. The slide that talked about an increase in visitors, but then later on you saw, no, there's a commitment not to increase the number of visitors, at least not intentionally. It's not built into the plan. We would ask that be reinforced, that commitment be in the application, as well as a cap on at any given moment a certain maximum attendance, particularly important during special events when all of the venues in the neighborhood are full. This is a disaster waiting to happen if there's a fire when all those venues are full of people. So there should be a cap in terms of any given moment, a certain number of people. Again, we request that you request the museum to put that in its plan. The other one is to not make a finding, don't do anything, please, which touches on what their baseline capacity number is. That's an issue to be discussed later. We don't want anything in here to be established in terms of what that baseline is. We also would like the museum circulation plan and traffic mitigation measures to simply be consistent with the Mission Canyon plan. In other words, again, a request, please coordinate with the Mission Canyon plan. Don't do anything to worsen ingress and egress from this neighborhood for residents.
Mr. Solomon, one more minute.
Okay, I'll be done. We'd also like to ask you to request that they include in their project application the measures that they're willing to take to minimize construction noise, vibration, and dust. This is a huge issue for us, especially going 2 stories down, 1 story down, and then they're talking about geothermal. That's another hole in the ground in the parking lot. I'm just envisioning all the vibration from breaking up those boulders. We want the best, obviously the best mitigation measures that are feasible. So again, it's just a request to plug into the project application the most feasible mitigation measures possible. And similarly with the operating noise in the future, the loading dock couldn't be in a worse place from our home's point of view, but it's got to be there. They need a loading dock. Don't do anything at this stage to lock in an open loading dock.
Wrap it up, please.
Leave it open. Thank you very much for considering the letter and these comments, and good luck with your deliberations.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon. The next request to speak is from Paul Collins. That will be followed by Paul Russell. You have 3 minutes, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. My name is Paul Collins. I'm the curator of vertebrate zoology at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, where I've worked for the last 38 years. I'd like to make a few comments about the museum's plans for restoring native woodlands found on parcels 1 and 2 and along the Mission Creek corridor as part of this overall master plan. We've already lost native plant and animal diversity on the museum's woodlands. Undeveloped areas of the oak and oak riparian woodlands on the museum property are currently degraded as a result of the spread of non-native understory plants such as periwinkle, nasturtium, honeysuckle, and ivy, and with non-native trees and saplings such as olive, pittosporum, acacia, and pine, Peruvian pepper, and eucalyptus. Today, the understory of most of our woodlands on the museum property are vegetated with a monoculture of these non-native plants. The decline and disappearance of native understory plants typical of oak and riparian woodlands has resulted in a decline in available native foods for wildlife and subsequently a reduction in the diversity and abundance of structural niches for wildlife that they can use for cover and nesting. As a result, these woodlands currently support fewer species of wildlife than can be found in more undisturbed woodlands in the region. We've lost species on the property, native species such as big-eared wood rats and California mice, and have seen declines in the occurrence of species like alligator lizards, ringneck snakes, ornate shrews, spotted towhees, and song sparrows. I'd hope that as the Commission considers the museum's proposed bioresources restoration plan as part of the overall master plan, that you'll keep your eye on the long-term benefits for wildlife and for the public that will result from this comprehensive restoration of woodlands on the museum Mission Creek corridor. Moving the museum's footprint away from the 25-foot top of bank setback, coupled with the replanting with native trees and understory plants typical of riparian woodlands in the wider creek setback, will have long-term benefits for terrestrial and aquatic wildlife that inhabit this reach of Mission Creek. Also, while there will be some short-term impacts following the removal of non-native plants from the museum's woodlands, wildlife are expected to move back into restored areas as native plant cover becomes established. In the long term, following habitat restoration, oak and oak riparian woodlands on the museum property are expected to provide a greater diversity of niches and available native foods for wildlife, which in turn are expected to support a higher diversity and abundance of native wildlife.
Mr. Collins, 45 seconds.
Okay. The long-term benefits for native wildlife far outweigh the temporary short-term impacts that will occur as these woodlands are being restored. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Next request to speak is Paul Russell, followed by Peter Schuyler.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Russell, and I'm a longtime trustee of the museum. The museum is many things, but at heart we're a scientific institution which strongly influences our exhibits, our programs, our education, and the needs we have for our buildings and our campus. Over nearly a century, we have built important collections, indeed irreplaceable collections, in many disciplines. These collections are an archive of our natural heritage and an essential tool for advancing new knowledge about our natural world. With a good curator and room for expansion, museum collections grow in both size and scientific value. It's almost inevitable. Without room to grow or a curator to shepherd them, collections inevitably decline, decay, and sometimes even disintegrate. Our scientists would have liked an additional 5,000 square feet for collection storage, about a 37% increase. After several rounds of paring back, our plans now provide for 300 square feet of additional space. That'll still going to allow for growth since the space is more efficiently configured, and we will utilize compacting systems wherever possible. But to reach this point, we had to abandon plans to reinstitute a geology paleontology department, which we even have partial funding for. This is just one example of how tightly designed this project already is. Boy, there were a lot of wish lists abandoned long before the fat-free plan that you see. The project is the most ambitious undertaking in the museum's history. Raising the money for it will be a challenge for the current board and for future boards. But we think we can succeed if we have a project that is truly visionary. Visionary for the museum, visionary for Santa Barbara. The plan before you embodies this vision, harmoniously melding the new with the old, with the historic, melding the buildings with the creek, the woodland, and the neighborhood.
One more minute.
It will be functional, visitor-friendly, and a model of sustainability. And we hope you will support this vision in full. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Mr. Schuyler, followed by Steve Hicks.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, and thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Peter Schuyler. I've lived most of my life here in Santa Barbara County. My family and I have had a long association with the Natural History Museum. I first started going to the museum over 50 years ago as a young child. My father was on the Board of Trustees for many years. My great-great-great-aunt sponsored some of William Dawson's important early works. Way back in the first part of the early century of the 20th century, he was one of the founders of the museum. In spite of this long connection, what excites me most about the request before you today is that the museum is not resting on its laurels, but instead is proactively looking forward to the next 50 or 100 years. And Santa Barbara in general is known for looking to the future. After the 1925 earthquake, the city seized the opportunity to reinvent its overall look and promote the city we know today. The environmental awakening that resulted from the 1969 oil spill remains with us today, not only here, but also throughout the whole country. On a no less ambitious scale, this proposal seeks to provide a natural history museum that continually expands and enhances our knowledge of the living world around us, while also integrating our architectural and cultural heritage and history. It involves our community's strong environmental and sustainability ethic, and it also supports our determination as a city to support world-class educational institutions. This proposal also strives to set a new standard of how to achieve this type of work in today's complicated world where numerous and conflicting mandates and regulations abound. This project is admittedly a huge undertaking, and there are a myriad of details, both small and large, that must be addressed before tangible on-the-ground work actually takes place. Some of these details will be easy, while others will tax everybody's patience and tolerance. When the inevitable stumbling blocks are reached, I can only urge you to keep the larger goal in mind, ensuring that the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History remains a vital and vibrant organization that honors our heritage, serves our community, and serves as a model for everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schuyler. Appreciate your brevity. Steve Hicks, followed by Heather Moffett.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity. My name's Steve Hicks. I'm a past board chair of the museum and current trustee. The point I would like to bring to you is a very straightforward one, and that is the range of participants in the development of this plan. When we started master planning or strategic planning 4 years ago, we made the first decision to make every attempt to stay on our current site, but also to engage the community to a very great and wide extent. As Dr. Hutter mentioned, we interviewed over 100 people in the community in the beginning of our strategic planning process. We came up with guiding principles that led to a new mission statement, a revised mission statement, and then worked into master planning with those principles in place. So what you have before you is not only a detailed plan, but we think and believe that it is truly reflective of the needs of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hicks. I appreciate your brevity. Next is Heather Moffett, followed by Don Olson.
Hello.
Hi. Welcome.
My name is Heather Moffett, and I am Director of Education and Exhibits at the Natural History Museum. Education is at the core of the museum's mission. We work to inspire a thirst for discovery and a passion for the natural world. The incomparable resources embodied by our scientists, our collections, and our natural setting provide a powerful combination for our science education programs for both adults and children. We strive to provide unique learning experiences that help visitors of all age construct a personal understanding of the natural world and their place in it. While many of our programs focus on experiencing science through nature, participants also explore how we learn about the natural world by being a part of the scientific process. From interpreting sensitive artifacts presented in our labs to examining creekside discoveries through our microscopes, these unique opportunities need adequate space to support them. The new master plan will help us achieve our educational goals in ways that our current facilities simply cannot. Our current teaching spaces are too small and scattered to effectively serve the diverse school groups, camps, and community organizations we serve. For instance, we host tens of thousands of school children each year, and with many with class sizes of 30 to 35 students, they just do not fit within our current classrooms. The new program spaces outlined in the master plan allow us the critical flexibility needed to meet the demands of our audiences and to more effectively deliver our educational services. As was mentioned today, we're not looking to serve more visitors, but we do want to provide better service to the ever-changing needs of our community. Having to work around our current limitations through makeshift shuffling and scheduling changes inhibits us from effectively reaching our audiences and fully meeting our educational goals. As we plan for the museum's second century with this master plan, we are envisioning a place capable of fully serving our audiences well instead of limiting the ways in which we can benefit our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Moffett. Next is Don Olson, followed by Norman Sprague.
Good afternoon.
I'm Don Olson. I'm here as a board member of the Upper East Neighborhood Association, and I'm also a member of the Museum's Master Plan Advisory Committee, which I've been a part of for over a year now. As you know, the museum is part of the Upper East neighborhood, and as you know, our neighborhood has deep historical roots, is predominantly a residential neighborhood, but also has a very large number of institutional uses that have been around for a long time, many of which have were established long before the city adopted any form of land use permitting processes or use permits. And as a result of that, they often are kind of flying in the wind when it comes to how they operate and carry on their activities. And as a result of that, the Upper East Association, as part of the Plan Santa Barbara process, proposed the strategy, an implementation strategy for inclusion in the land use element, which basically urged the city to try and find a way to deal with these long-term institutional uses and make them much more compatible with the neighborhood. And the museum, of course, is one of those institutional uses that has been around for a long time. And as you've heard today and know from your previous work, it's on one of the most complex sites that we have in the community. Given the historic resources, the creek corridor, the woodland, and the conundrum of jurisdictional reviews that will be involved in this planning process as it proceeds. And as part of my involvement on the advisory committee, the Master Plan Advisory Committee for the museum, I've really come to appreciate the complexity of this situation and the challenges that they face. And I've also come to learn much more about what the museum is and how important it is in our community as part of our educational infrastructure. It's not just the exhibits and the collections and all, it's the place they are and what they mean for all the visitors and the kids that go there day in and day out. And it's come to where I feel that the museum is essentially part of our family, part of our community family, and deserves our support and assistance as they take on these challenges and move through this permitting process. And with that spirit, I would really urge you to do what you can as part of this process to help them carry on with the great work that they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Norman Sprague will be followed by Palmer Jackson, Jr.
Good afternoon. My name's Norm Sprague, and I'm a museum trustee and the chairman of the Master Planning Committee. I'd like to just emphasize two things. First, that the planning is absolutely necessary. Not only are our facilities old and deteriorating, but the museum has been here for almost 100 years and is in danger of becoming irrelevant to the community and to the challenges of the present and the future. The museum can't remain static. It has to transform itself for the next century. Second, I'd like to emphasize how comprehensive the planning process has been. It's extended over 4 years, literally thousands of hours, almost 30 consultants. There's been broad involvement of the trustees, the staff, and the community, and every option we can think of has been discussed in detail. We believe this is the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sprague. Next is Palmer Jackson, Jr., followed by Callum DeForest.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Palmer Jackson, and I am the chairman of the board of the trustees of the Museum of Natural History. I represent the third generation of my family to be associated with the museum, and I'm a fourth generation Santa Barbaran. The master plan proposal before you is designed to allow the museum to thrive in its second century of service to Santa Barbara and the region. The plan is a result of a vast amount of work and thought by the board, staff, volunteers, members of the community, and a core of professional consultants. When we embarked on strategic planning in 2007, we were keenly aware not only of our institution's remarkable history as a community treasure, but also of the changing realities and needs of the natural world, of science, and of society that the museum serves. The insights we gained convinced us that the museum's existing physical facilities fall far short of what is needed to underpin its first-rate programs in education, scientific research, conservation of invaluable collections, and community services. This realization gained further urgency by the mounting evidence that many of the museum's buildings are in a state of serious decline. The board came to the conclusion that the importance of the museum's work, its critical role as a cultural and educational institution, and its international reputation call for a long-term plan that is visionary as well as audacious. We elected to set aside timid objectives and challenge ourselves to meet new standards. As a result, specific details of the plan may seem to be counter to beloved notions of how things are done, but they are driven by compelling goals and an overriding logic. The plan we are proposing will challenge us all, but the vision of the Museum of Natural History that underlies it is truly worthy of this extraordinary place we call Santa Barbara. And it recapitulates in a new form and in a new century the vision our forefathers had 95 years ago when they founded the museum. I hope that you will join us in the challenge we have set for ourselves and embrace this vision. Thank you.
Mr. Jackson. Mr. DeForest. Now you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. When the museum was founded 95 years ago, it was founded to include all natural history, both fauna and flora. Hence, the Botanic Garden was a logical spin-off when that property became available, and so the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden was a satellite of in part of the Museum of Natural History. With the untimely death of the first paid director of the museum, Mr. Herder's Dr. Herder's predecessor, Ralph Hoffman, who was the brother of Bernard Hoffman, in 1932 he fell off a cliff on Santa Cruz Island, according to the story, because he had saw a specimen of a plant that he hadn't seen before and wanted to bring it back to the museum. What happened was that the next director was not interested in flora at all. So, hence the split off of the Botanic Garden as a separate institution and the lack of any appreciation of the riparian corridor. So just to push more exhibit space and building space into that corridor. So I think there is a strong reason to restore the corridor and take down those additional buildings as the plan envisions, and to bring back the flora to the riparian corridor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeForest. And with that, the award for brevity goes to Norman Sprague. Thank you, Mr. Sprague. I will close public comment, and we will go to questions from the commissions. And I want to remind the commissions that some of us have to leave. Well, Mr. Justice needs to leave by 10 after 4. So I'm going to start with questions from you, Mr. Justice. If we could have at least 2 or 3 of the applicant team up here to answer questions.
Thank you. I'd like to start by saying that the museum and the proposal we have before us is to natural history education, values, and our regional IQ what the airport is to the region's economic vitality and what Cottage Hospital is to the community's health. And that's the way I look at this project, as something that is one of the most outstanding institutions and important institutions that we have before us, and the need to support that. I think the key words here are connectivity and balancing act. And you have your work cut out for you in terms of the balancing act, because I think that the issues of making connections through to the mission, all the issues surrounding that little corner of all these public spaces and institutional spaces needs to be dealt with. Although it's off-site, I acknowledge the work you're doing to try to support that process. A couple of points. Specifically, I think the proposal is very thoughtful, precedent-setting in a positive way, and shows considerable depth and complexity. And I don't have any specific suggestions, questions, or changes that I would see at this point in time. The conditional use permit requires special sensitivity to the neighborhood. And we heard from a neighbor here that those things need to be taken into account, and I'm sure you will. Pre-mitigating impacts is also very important to facilitate a timely and speedy review. And I would hope that this could go through with considerable speed, because this is going to create the next generation's capacity to solve problems, both community-wide and much farther beyond. And I truly appreciate the level of effort that has gone into this. I will weigh in with specific comments as this comes before us for the EIR, the environmental review process. But the last thing to point out is I think that the net zero goal is huge, absolutely huge. If you could do that, this would set itself away from anything else we've seen. So fantastic work. Continue on the good course, and we hope to see you back as soon as possible, at least from my standpoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Justice. And I'm going to start with Mr. Schallenberger. Any questions, Commissioner Schallenberger?
Just a point of clarification. One of the letters quoted here from Mrs. Lauren Carey, I find it funny that per Carl Hutterer, we, quote, really try to be good neighbors. Not once has he approached the owners of Los Encinas Lane to sit down and talk about the direct impact their expansion will have on us. But this doesn't jive with, I think there's been a ton of community outreach, and I'd just like to have the applicant clarify or concede the point, one of the two. So just for public record, what has been the community outreach in a nutshell?
Dr. Hutter, if you could just briefly outline.
In just a few seconds, we actually started the very planning with the community outreach. We went door to door in Mission Canyon, knocking or saying, we are up to something, come and talk to us. We have since then had, I think, 9 community outreach meetings. We have mailed things to thousands of addresses. We have done presentations. We have an annual Mission Canyon barbecue where we make presentations. We have an annual membership barbecue where we make presentations. So I think we have done a fair amount.
It sounds like your outreach is pretty extensive. I want to know, though, how many people actually opened the door when you knocked on it?
Well, not that many, but we left things at the door.
Mr. Schallenberger, any other questions right now? Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you. And, Mr. Chair, I don't have time constraints, so if others do, I'd be happy to
Okay. Anyone else have a time constraint that wants to? You can't. Go ahead,
okay,
Commissioner Schwartz.
Okay. I think the first question might be for staff, Mr. Lawson, if he's still in the room. Thank you, Mr. Lawson. In terms of the process before us and for the applicant to move forward, and given that this is roughly 18 acres that spans both the county and the city, and there's a reference in Ms. Elledge's package about a process without a timeline or details associated with annexing the county's portion into the city. Could you speak to the status of that for us?
Sure. Commissioner Schwartz, we went to City Council for a measuring allocation for additional commercial square footage, a process called a preliminary allocation. As part of that, we also did an initiation. An initiation process is really an informal consultation, early heads up to the decision maker that this is what they're thinking about, and at that point there was no objection. What will happen next is we will have a full application submitted by the applicant, and part of that request will be to annex those parcels within the county, and then we'll move forward. And we'll be, as already said, before your commission for first a environmental document, then after that for the project, which will include a recommendation to council for the annexation.
Okay, thank you. When we get to comments, I'll include my comments related to that. Then I have a question, if someone's here from transportation who has looked at this Mission Canyon Puesta del Sol proposal, new pocket, striping, etc. Oh, there's Ms. Swanson. Thank you, Ms. Swanson.
I just also want to let the commission know that in addition to transportation, we have representatives from the fire department, if you have questions for the fire department.
So coming from the mission,
Do you want to put it on
excuse me?
Do you want to put it on the?
Sure, if that's appropriate. Coming from the mission, Ms. Swanson, and as I round the corner there over the bridge on Mission Canyon, and conceiving of or conceptualizing of the proposal to create a left turn pocket, I'm trying to understand what the issues would be. Line of sight issues and safety issues. You come around that corner and how quickly that left turn pocket will appear, and the potential backup of those, especially on a very busy day at the museum, making a left turn. I think it's a fairly blind corner myself, and I just went up there and walked the area again this week. So could you speak to what kind of studies have been done and whether or not you're comfortable then with what's being proposed and what we see on the site plans?
Sure. Preliminary traffic and parking analysis was provided by the applicant, which we reviewed as part of the PRT application. Okay. And it does discuss site distance, and it meets the requirements and exceeds them. We did, of course, go out to the site with our traffic engineer and looked at the proposed improvements with the left turn pocket, and there aren't issues with regard to visibility. It would prevent the queuing that would occur. I'm not sure if that was your question, but without a left turn pocket. So it would allow people to get out of the way and people to continue going north, of course, on Mission Canyon Road. So there are other concerns associated with the widening of Mission Canyon at that area because, as you know, there's an unimproved pedestrian path on the opposite side of Mission Canyon, and then people cross to get to the museum. And that would be decreased from what it is now. It's not formally improved on that side. So our concerns related to Mission Canyon are the lack of pedestrian and bicycle improvements to that section, and we know it's a big issue for the whole stretch of Mission Canyon. But widening the road would take away from what's already a kind of substandard, pedestrian access route. So we're looking for some formal pedestrian and bicycle improvements in that section.
Okay. Since we're in concept review today, I don't want to get too far into the details, sure. But I want to express, as I did almost a year ago, concern about the circulation path and the safety around that. And perhaps, Mr. Chair, if it's appropriate, at our subsequent meeting, get into more details with you about how many cars do you anticipate could be in queue and it could still be safe, because this is a lingering question in my mind and concern. Thank you. Can I have my slide plan back? Thank you.
And I do want to keep, questions and comments fairly general, because we're not taking action, and we don't really want to give them too much direction at this point.
Right. Last question is about the surfacing for the new plan out in the parking lot. And I think perhaps, Mr. Schachter, maybe you mentioned this. Was it 38% reduction overall with your new plan of paved spacing on the property? Is that about right?
That's a combination of paving and structures.
Paving and structures.
Right.
Okay.
So it's a 38% decrease in impervious surface.
Okay. I think those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. Commissioner Lavoie, questions?
Mr. Chair, I have one very specific question. The green roof, does it include organic material?
The question is, does the roof include organic material? We're going to ask our landscape architect to give us.
Just a yes or no would be fine.
Maybe 5% or a little more, depending on how you're defining it. Did you want me to include the plant materials?
You're defining it as a green roof. I want to know if there's organic material in that. On that.
In order to answer your question, is it okay if I explain to you what it will be composed of?
No.
Rather than yes or no?
Just yes or no?
Some.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Van Anna. Okay. That's it? Okay. Commissioner Murray?
Yes.
Talk about word for brevity.
I would like to ask, one of the commentators mentioned the sensitivity with the Mission Canyon Association, and I wanted to hear whether you have worked with their guidelines or whatever, just what I heard.
To answer your question briefly, yes, we have. I think the commentator made a specific point about making sure that what we are doing in our mitigation plans is consistent with the goals of the Mission Canyon Community Plan, and we do need to take a look at that. We haven't put effort into making sure of that consistency up till now, so we will be looking at that. But with the association, we have been coordinating with them.
May I ask somebody that for a second?
Yes.
Just to mention that I have personally briefed the Mission Canyon board and the full membership meeting twice on the progress of our planning and the details of it.
Thank you. The next question is, will there be a traffic light in that turn into the left-hand turn?
At this point in time, no, there is not a proposal for that or a need for it that we have identified.
Thank you, Commissioner Justice, for coming. Commissioner Sharp, your questions.
One quick question, getting back to the 38%. You're saying that we're having 38% less impervious area. Does that mean you're replacing existing paving with paving that is pervious?
Yes, that's correct. So, for example, the current parking lot is all asphalt and impervious, and the proposal is to remove that and replace it with a pervious surface.
So it's a little bit confusing to the public in general as to the fact that 38% is not exactly taking away impervious area to landscaping. It's one parking lot service to another.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Boucher? Okay. Commissioner Bartlett, any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is, I wanted to understand the nature of how you would propose phasing the project so that I could better understand how that would impact the neighborhood. I understand what it's going to be when it's done, but how do you get there and stay viable and operational in the meantime?
That's a good question.
So we didn't actually present a phasing plan today because it's still under discussion,
We have a thumbnail for that plan, excuse me, which we've used all along, but we're actually starting this week, beginning to work with the construction management and cost estimating group to delve into that more seriously. I think here's what we can say, which I think is important to note. One is we do not intend to phase this in a manner in which we would start construction and then build it in continuous phases over time so that construction goes on for 6, 8, 10, or 12 years. We're talking about discrete phases of development, each of which would stop and start. You might imagine that each construction phase might take about 2 years, and it's likely, just because of the reality of fundraising, that each one of these phases would be separated by 10 years or more. The question as to how it would be phased is really contingent on how successful each capital campaign is. So if, for example, the money was available and it was possible to build it in 2 phases or 1, then obviously the museum would choose to do that. More likely it will be built, well, we have it organized so it could be built in 5 phases, but if it was built in 5 phases, it's probably a 30-year project because of the timelines, even more. The other thing we've realized in this last phase of looking at the project, particularly the conversation that we've had with our arborist, and it was reflected in the quote that we showed, phasing of the improvements to the oak woodland and the oak and sycamore repairing corridor, that's a different idea about phasing. In other words, the discussion is underway to begin making those improvements today so that the improvement to habitat and the increase in tree canopy cover is underway, so at the point in time we get to construction projects and we have to do, as I said in the presentation, this monopoly game of moving the pieces around, we're already making progress towards the total improvement of the site. So 2 different phasing issues there.
Great. I appreciate it because it is difficult and we're trying to figure out how to help you get there.
Right.
But it comes with trade-offs to impacts to the neighborhood. So.
Any other questions, Commissioner Bartlett?
I had one question. The site diagram that was up earlier that shows the proposed recirculation on the street indicates changing to one-way or limiting to one-way where that stop sign is near your parking lot. Why is it two-way?
Can we get this? Thank you. Okay.
Why is it two-way in this direction if the exit from the parking lot only allows you to go here? Why would you also have the option to go that way? It looks like you intended everybody to come here, so I'm not understanding how that intersection works.
So the design idea behind that that one-way, two-way situation you're looking at is we don't want, if we change major ingress and egress to Puesta del Sol, we don't want people using Puesta del Sol as a shortcut to get around having to go up Mission Canyon to get to Foothills. And we know, historically, having talked to neighbors, that there was a point in time in which you came and went on Puesta del Sol. It didn't always go all the way around the backside. People used it as a shortcut. So we would like to prevent people by doing that, by making that intersection where Puesta del Sol is heading, we're heading west, and then we turn and head north again. We want to make that one way so nobody can cut through, but we don't want to prevent people in the neighborhood from continuing to enjoy two-way traffic on that leg.
Well, I guess that gets to my question. Why wouldn't this lane then be totally eliminated in this stretch? Why would you need two-way here if the neighborhood is really starting up in that?
Well, I think that's a good question, and we can go back and take another look at that and see if that traffic diverter actually should be moved to the north. Yeah.
Thank you,
And
Commissioner.
then my one last question. It seems like we have an inherent conflict in terms of our goals for sustainability and the goals for fire protection. And I'd like to really understand between the fire department and others that are involved how we justify or rectify that, because from what I'm understanding, you can't do green roofs in the high fire zone. and they don't really enjoy solar panels on the roof for firefighters. So and then we also get the big loop driveway that the fire department wants around the building, which is kind of counter to our, impervious surfaces and that type thing. So I really want to understand, what's a given and where there are trade-offs, because I think fire department is really driving us in the opposite direction of sustainability on many of these issues.
So let me address that briefly. Starting with the green roofs, the fire department has been very explicit in expressing their concern about the green roofs, but we've engaged them in a dialogue, and we have also been in a dialogue with the green roofing industry and with the testing and code officials. And I'm happy to be able to report that FM, which is one of the major international testing agencies, just completed the first tested assembly of a green roof. So we now actually have a green roof with a fire-rated assembly, which we never had before. We just got that information yesterday. Fire Marshal was aware that we were pursuing it and that testing was going on. We haven't had a chance to share it. So we're on the cusp of an emerging industry. We are doing everything we can to demonstrate that actually it's a sensible approach. There certainly is literature on the fact that the additional insulation provided by the material that the plants live in provides additional protection to a roof assembly. So we're kind of pioneering when it comes to that one. As far as the solar panels are concerned, we actually have not heard and expressed concern on behalf of the fire marshal. As far as the loop access road goes, it's not, to be honest, it's not being required by the fire marshal, but it is best practices, obviously, for fire protection, not only for the buildings, but actually for the creek and the woodlands, because it gives them access to be able to deal with a fire there. That surface, except where it turns back up the hill on the far side, the east side of the existing historic buildings, is all pervious surface. The issue as to whether we might be able to use grasscrete or other kinds of paving that would actually give it a green texture, the fire marshal is still not happy with. Certainly, I have experience with doing that in other jurisdictions successfully. I don't know. That's an open question. We raised it when we were here a year ago. It's an open question as to how to get a better dialogue about that. But we are talking about pervious surface down the entire length of that route.
Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Commissioner Bartlett. Commissioner Urbias, any questions?
Yes, I have quite a few, actually. Have you ever discussed or considered adaptive reuse of some of the buildings that you are now designating for demolition?
Adaptive reuse in terms of putting them to a different purpose?
Yes.
No, we haven't, because of a number of reasons. And they're all, I guess, equivalent, so I'm not going to list them in any priority. First of all, the physical condition of these buildings, and we didn't show it, but in the intervening years since we've been here, we've done a seismic analysis, a pest analysis, and a water infiltration moisture analysis. To get these buildings to serve us for another 100 years, they're basically going to have to be rebuilt in place.
You are talking about green roofs, and you are also going to have labs in the buildings, and you will be using chemicals that will require hoods, and therefore you're going to have ventilation system out on the roofs from those hoods. Have you considered that?
We have.
Or it's too early in the game, I don't know.
Well, no, actually, it's not too early in the game to discuss it. We have yet to identify that's an issue. There are many science labs that have green roofs on them, so it hasn't occurred to us that that's an issue. We'll take a look at it.
Well, being from a scientific lab, I can tell you,
Yeah.
you
Okay.
need
So
hoods.
then we will take a look at it.
The capacity of the creek concerns me. What is its current capacity in regard to the number, the flood level that it could take? A 20-year storm, a 40-year storm, not a 100-year storm, obviously. Do you know?
I don't know that we have an answer for that one. I think we'll have to do
My
some research.
concern is this: if you are setting back from the creek and assuming that that is going to solve the problem of flooding, you need to look at the 100-year flood, because that can come down and hit your proposed buildings, and your basements can well be flooded. you need to make absolutely sure, because I know specifically that the flood maps are not very accurate, and that you should probably get a LOMA or your own individual survey to make sure
Okay.
that those buildings are not in any danger from a 100-year storm.
That turned into a comment.
I'm sorry. And may you have a root barrier. And you're talking about water retention. What is your capacity of the water retention program that you have on site? What storm capacity?
So I can't give you the details on that. We can obtain them for you. Our civil engineer has worked with our landscape architect to design a natural drainage system that meets current code. But beyond that, we'll have to get you the actual statistics.
Okay, you're talking about 24,600 cut and 1,900 fill. Have you done any planning or on how you're going to handle that problem, that situation?
In terms of import-export, I don't know, where are we with that in terms of, Civil has yet to look at that.
Well, I know he determined the cut and fill.
Okay, so we've calculated the cut and fill, but we don't have an answer for that question.
Okay. These are things that I think need to be answered
Absolutely.
in Phase 2, and
Yeah.
I'm not criticizing Phase 1, but we need to know details and things like that. Also, the pedestrian bridge that you're going, new pedestrian bridge, what that is going to hold in capacity for the water going through. In reading through the document, I am concerned that, and I think you will agree, we do have a thing going, you know. I mean, he criticizes me every time. That we need as much detail in plans as possible. And when I read the documents, and this is a comment, and I see trees being, I need specific locations, size. I need to know if you're going to restore a habitat, who's going to maintain it. When I read comments that say, like on page 21, where it says where feasible, that's not specific. That's pie in the sky. And also, who's going to maintain, if you plant off-site, who's going to be maintaining that watershed? Where are you going to park buses? And I have real concerns at a 20-year, this is a comment also, the 20-year life is too long. It should be shorter because things do change. Anyway, these are my concerns and comments.
Thank you. I'm going to skip over you to the comment period. Commissioner Larson. Questions?
Not a problem. I have lots of practice at questions. So I only have two. One is a real basic one that's going to expose my ignorance. But, you know, the only geothermal well field I'm familiar with is in Yellowstone Park. You're putting one in a parking lot. So I would like just a short, very brief explanation of what a geothermal well field is.
Well, one that you might want to check out is in the county courthouse here in Santa Barbara.
Oh, great.
Right under your nose.
Didn't know.
I know.
So really, really briefly, the notion of a geothermal well field is to drill holes and use the earth as a giant heat exchanger. And we draw heat out of the earth in the winter and cooling in the summer. And so it's a natural cycle.
I'll Google it and get more.
Yeah.
Thanks, but I did want to ask just in case. there
Right,
was
but we've done them successfully on 3 separate buildings now, and the first building we're going to have that's going to be net zero is going to be a combination of solar arrays and geothermal, just like this is.
Thank you. My second question is, I'm sure, are you prioritizing your phases? You know, you're going through these phases. Do you have a priority as you're going through phases 1 through 5, or however you're going to end up doing it? Is it by priority or by something else?
The phasing will be prioritized. One of the complex there are many complex factors that will eventually figure in the phasing proposal that we will submit. One of them is the simple need to have a fully functioning museum at the completion of each phase. And not only does the museum need to function, it ought to be better than it was before that phase was commenced. which is in itself a major challenge. Other issues that figure into phasing are simply the configuration of the campus itself, what can be done at any one point. As you remove part of some buildings and you accommodate others, it's a fairly complicated dance. And then, of course, the whole interface with the environmental issues and neighborhood issues and all those kinds of things. So we still have, I think it's fair to say, a fair amount of work to do to settle on the phasing. And to be totally frank, my personal preference would be that we didn't have to phase. We could do it in one single fall sweep. And like ripping off a Band-Aid, paint is sharp but short. But I don't think many people expect that we could do it in one phase, simply because of the cost and the size of the project. But that would be the ideal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Larson. Commissioner Jordan, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Questions?
Yes.
No,
Questions.
I just have a couple quick ones. I was confused, or I'm not confused, about the Topic Creek math, where you're talking about the retaining wall. And I think I heard you say that you're basically using a line that's in air over the creek rather than the Topic Creek as the retaining wall. Is that true?
So when the property was surveyed recently, the surveyor is required to establish the top of creek, which is the position that the surveyor feels the creek would retreat to if it was allowed to go back to its natural angle of repose. And all of the setback requirements, the environmental setbacks, don't start from where the creek actually is now, which is, I mean, that edge of creek is artificial due to all those retaining walls. All those setbacks start much further into the property, presuming that that creek retaining assembly would fall away someday. So our setbacks are further.
So the top of creek is closer to the building than the retaining wall.
Right.
Okay, I misunderstood you. And then I moseyed through the, for reasons that escape me, the resource report a couple of days ago, and I've heard you, I think, use the disclaimer in the demolition several times as you're going to knock down no currently designated buildings. Mm-hmm. But there is a graph somewhere back in a short executive summary in the resource report that lists a bunch of other buildings that I think you would be knocking down that could be designated. Is that true?
Correct. Absolutely.
So when you're thinking about this from a layman's standpoint of a concept review of what you want to do with buildings, where does this process go from there? If you're talking about putting buildings here and there and knocking some down, but where does the resource designation process go from here now that you have this report and other buildings could be designated that you also want to knock down?
So that's going to be a question for the commission as part of its process, and maybe you actually want to.
Is Mr. Jacobus in the room? No. Okay. I would prefer to defer that question to our staff.
That's just a tough. I would call it backwards a little bit from my standpoint, trying to look at where buildings are going to go and what you want to do, but at the same time, there's this gray area. Maybe we won't let them knock this building down.
Basically, the commission and the city will make a recommendation to city council on designation or assignation of landmark based on our review of the historian's assessment of that building.
Okay.
So that comes before the determination of knock it down or keep it, rehabilitate it.
Okay, that would be my questions. Thank you.
I might be wrong.
So just to clarify, if these buildings are then added to the list of designated structures, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no place for the project to go. Then it becomes a question of overriding consideration and environmental review.
It doesn't preclude them from being altered or developed or whatever. I have a few questions, and then I'm going to just run back through, see if anybody else has questions. What happens to the historic entrance here?
So the historic entrance physically would be unaltered. It would be accessible from the gardens in front of the building. It would not be the major entry to the campus.
Okay. Yeah, that is too bad. But that's a comment, so I'm not going to do there. But and are you using any of the what we're kind of calling, and the report is kind of calling at this point, historic structures? Are you using are you going to continue to use them as exhibit halls and public use?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just want to get that on record. I believe it was you, Mr. Shack, that talked about approximately 26,000 square feet in the increase of woodland area. Is that in addition to what is, say, defined, a defined perimeter, or is that sort of converting open land to woodland within that perimeter? Did you understand that question?
I think so.
Okay.
And it's actually a little bit of both. There are areas within the woodland that you could see on the aerial photographs and on the mapping that we showed you of the vegetative cover. I think it was a yellow color where I think Walter pointed out that there were bare spots from previous development. Those areas don't constitute woodland, although in terms of there being trees or understory, but they are within the perimeter of the greater woodland. And we are counting those areas as being converted to woodland, so that adds into the calculation. But then there are areas outside the oak woodland. One that comes to mind is the area north of the parking lot, where there's eucalyptus and ornamental plantings that we're also proposing to convert. So,
okay, thank you. That did answer my question. Okay, any other commissioners have questions? Yeah, Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I think this is to the project team. As I make my way through the details at this point of the conditional use permit, and again in rereading Ms. Elledge's presentation, on page 16 under operational components, and it ties in with a statement on page 23, and this goes to whether or not occupancy caps will be an important part of our discussion going forward as we get into the details of the plan. Do you have currently a list of events and attendance statistics that you'll be bringing forward so we can look at that relative to parking needs, relative to occupancy cap, and what is feasible for the property under the new master plan?
yes, between now and the time that we file the DART application, we will be compiling that information and presenting it.
So then let me ask you to help me reconcile. On the one hand, I've seen I think you have 156 current parking spaces, and there doesn't seem to be a proposal to increase the attendance or visitor volume. However, I see another figure of 171 parking spaces, an increase with the proposed master plan. So I'm trying to understand the delta between those and why, if there's no intensification of use, would you need more parking spaces? And if you don't want to get into that today, I'll say put that on your list and bring it to us going forward. As you've probably heard, the commission has been looking very carefully and in great detail at conditional use permit allowances, obligations, mitigations, and I think this is something that's going to come right back. And so I think you'd be best served in really rolling up your sleeves and getting into the details as you move forward. That's my other question, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
I don't think I want you to answer that right now. Any other?
I can provide just a quick general response.
Yes. It's a little bit more specific. Mr. Schellenberg, any questions?
Understood.
Commissioner LaVoy, any questions? Murray, Sharp, Boucher, Bartlett, I'm not asking Arias, Larson. Okay, Jordan. Okay, then let's go to comments. And we'll start with Commissioner Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to, of course, well, not of course, but certainly echo Mr. Justice's comments at the start. I think he really states the obvious, and from my standpoint, too, as a parent with 4 children who have grown up there, he kind of brings the science side, I kind of bring the home family side. I even spent time after that gracious walkthrough talking about the disconnect between when you have children that have gotten to a certain age and go away, and then you don't see anybody till they retire, and how do we connect back to the community with that middle age of people. So I look forward to seeing this project go forward, and I'm hoping for good things. And I will quickly just go down my list of items that I'd like to see coming further on. And Ms. Elledge, if I go too fast, I have notes, and you can pick them up later. One of the public speakers commented on the CUP baseline, whether it's 1989, what's today. Let's not get into that. And I heard comment earlier from the applicant team that you're asking no more than what was there then, but the staff report disagrees with that and says certainly there must be more that's going to be asked. And I think that's one thing that needs to be clearly shown as you go forward on exactly what you're going to need. I share Commissioner Schwartz's concern with the left turn intersection. I drive that road going up to St. Mary's every Tuesday night at 5:15, and it's not, and I don't think it's so much the line of sight. It's the dynamic of coming over a ridge, accelerating. You have that little thing on the right that's trying to get in and get on the street, and then you get the turn on the left, and I just I continue to share that concern. I also think there's a undercurrent of disagreement on the circular road as concerns what you want to do versus what the fire department says is a minimum that they need, that they don't necessarily need that road behind the building, and they could get to it through an inner courtyard. I think the circular road, you're going to really have to make a case that it benefits the habitat along the creek side, and I don't know how you're going to do that, but that would be the case I'd hope you could make. I am a little, as the only one who talked a year ago about trying to incorporate employer-based rental housing into the project. I'm a little underwhelmed by the 4 or 5 units that okay, well, at the end of the project, right? But I think there's still more opportunity. I took some notes. If you have 14 full-time scientists, I know you have visiting researchers. I know you have other full-time employees. My personal comment would just be I think there's opportunities there to do more. And if it can't be for your own people, then it can be for other employers in town where they would be leaving the premises during the day when you need the resources there and coming back at night when you don't need the resources. I'd like to see some more information on the oak habitat numbers and disagreements on how you build oak habitat. And obviously, I think staff's position is if you have a circle of oak habitat, but you have some space inside, they're not giving you that credit for filling in that space. Exactly. They'd like to see you fill in outside space. Exactly. So I'd like to see that resolved. And then I think you're on your way to this, but one thing I was really pleased to see by the end of Valverde going in front of City Council was the development of a structured advisory neighborhood board. If not now, then certainly through the phases of construction. So not an outreach product per se, but a structured board that meets regularly and involves the neighbors and gets them involved on a structured basis. And I think that will do it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Jordan. And I do want to remind the commissions that staff is looking for as specific direction as possible in comments. And this is, all due respect to you, Mr. Jordan, you did good comments, but remind the rest of the commissioners. However, I want to remind them that we are not making a decision today, and we should just try and give them as clear guidance as possible. So with that, I will turn it over to Commissioner Larson for her comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, the comments from either end, Commissioner Jordan and Commissioner Schwartz, certainly helped me make mine brief. I just wanted to take you back to a time when we were both I was on this side and you were on that side, and all you were asking for was a temporary permit for the butterfly exhibit. Wasn't that keen? And we said, well, but certainly you're going to do more. I remember that. And here you are. But I do want to speak briefly to observation of that Mission Canyon specific plan, and to have a good look at that and look for continuity as you're going through your own plan. with that Mission Canyon specific plan, which is a county document, but nonetheless is a good document and an important thing. So I have a copy of it, and then I was looking through, kind of coordinating, but I didn't have the time to go through the whole volume and do it. But I'd say just keep your eye on that as you go forward. In terms of the museum, I really understand the need for the for the resource to expand in our community. You know, at a time when school curricula is shrinking constantly, it's really important to have something like the Museum of Natural History for children to go to actually see applied science. And I think that's such a wonderful thing. I know on the tour it thrilled me because I had to take zoology twice in college to get through it. But I was so excited because I understood what was there. But it was so many years later that I finally got to see it in action. Thrilling to me. And I think it's thrilling that kids have that opportunity right here in our community. And the fact that you open doors to students and to volumes of students is great. And so those are largely, I don't have any big comments at this level. The traffic has been discussed. My question about priority was answered. So I look forward to this coming along and with great interest and affection for the museum. Thank you.
Commissioner Larson. Commissioner Arias, anything to add to your comments?
Just a couple of items. I think the project is going to rest on the details of how and what and when, so that nobody's surprised by something happening that wasn't clearly designated in the beginning. And I also think you need to be very sensitive to the neighbors. I know that I have something near me that when they have an event, I can, even with my windows closed, I can hear every word that's being said. The last little comment I'd like to make, I know from personal experience how difficult it is to move a building, and I wish you lots of luck on it because it's not fun, and unfortunately our master mover, Louis Doan, has passed away. But he was the one that really could move the buildings. Good luck.
Thank you, Commissioner Arias. Commissioner Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I think we've had good comments, especially Commissioner Jostis, and applauding the effort for net zero, but I would take the tact in the middle of being more the naturalist. You know, I would rather not emphasize the solar panels on the roof to offset the air conditioning that's running. I would see a more passive approach to this site where the buildings are transparent, they tread lightly on the site, you have natural ventilation, and it's really more like setting up a camp to enjoy the site rather than doing one scientific thing to offset something that's totally opposite. So I hope that you can take the naturalist approach. It's the Natural History Museum. Celebrate that aspect. Use the science where you have to, but I don't think that aspect of the science is what's on display at this museum. It's how you fit into this environment. So I hope you can take that approach, and I think in the end, if you do it right, it will be far more affordable and something to celebrate even more. I mean, net zero is great, but if you start out more balanced, you have to do less to counteract the other things that you're not going overboard on. In terms of the site, I appreciate the changes that have made since we saw it last year. I think going to more pavilions for the above grade structures is going to be more fitting, and I hope that you will continue working on that. The aesthetic values of it that I can barely see, I know this is don't seem that it's matching up nearly as well as I had hoped with the architecture that we're trying to celebrate, so hopefully that will evolve before it comes back, and I know that really will be the purview of HLC, but I hope it would move in that direction.
Got you covered.
Yep. I know. Can't help myself.
I know.
I need to make it a question, right? I think it's covered, right?
Okay, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Was that it, Mrs. Commissioner Bartlett?
Well, and the other thing that I liked, I think, would be sort of the sense of sustainability, not only in how you treat the site, but I think enhancing the housing experience and the fact that you're housing, not only the director, but some of the workers, and I think really celebrate that aspect. So I'd like to see maybe a little more emphasis put on that portion of the project as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bartlett. Commissioner Boucher, any questions or comments? Any?
I've been going to this museum since I was 3 years old.
Oh, boy.
Hope the rattlesnake is thing like that.
Microphone.
Anyway, I'm very pleased with this. I think we'll have comments on the architecture as it progresses. But those are my comments for the moment.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Boucher. Commissioner Sharp?
Just a couple of comments. I think working with the Mission Canyon residents all around, up 5 miles, everywhere is going to be very important in getting the project approved. And as Mr. Joseph said, we certainly appreciate the level of quality and your dedication to clearly making it a superb project. I continue to question the necessity for the Creekside Fire Access Road. I believe Mr. Jordan mentioned opening up the interior to allow fire apparatus to come into the site that way rather than necessarily taking the more obvious route, which would be around. That opens up all sorts of possibilities. And lastly, to me, it's very important to juxtapose the buildings rather than the simple linearity that you have. You have a very rural site that has the ability to parallel the creek or do various things and not treat this as an urban site, but treat it as what it is and get some life, and even a 5 or 10% turn in some of the buildings just creates spaces that you don't have when you have everything parallel.
Good comment. Commissioner Murray, any comments?
I will keep my comments to the historic parts of the project because everybody's covering all the other parts, and we are a landmarks commission, so I'll stay with that. As you think of your phasing of the project, I would ask that you put the historical priority in it. We have had not good experience with other projects where the historical restoration or rehabilitation did not take place, and I want that to be a priority. I'm also echoing Mr. Sharp's concern about that loop. To me, that is an impact on what you're trying to create, which is restore the creek side. So you can look at that along. I also have. I was really appreciative of what Kellum DeForest mentioned because I had heard this rumor before, and so I'm looking to helping you. And the historians are going to come forward with the Phase 2 report on how best we can find a way to keep the integrity of the building as well as providing the creek setback restoration. Also, like Mr. Sharp, I am concerned. I really like the spatial relationship that you've created between the old and the new building. However, I am troubled still with the size and scale and the linearity of the big structures. You will continue to look at that, but I think that Mr. Sharp's comment about the way the angles of those buildings could better wrap around the site rather than just these rectangular shoe boxes as you see them now. So I will be looking to that. The McVeigh's house, I hope when you move it, it will also be part of that historical restoration rehabilitation priority, because I think once you take care of the historic resources, so then they come up to light and they're ready to be the beacon for the next century, then the other parts of it will fall into place. I also concur very much with what Mr. Olson said, that we are treating this application as the family of Santa Barbara among all the major institutions that make our city. So I'm looking forward to working with you in every capacity I can.
Thank you, Commissioner Murray. Commissioner LaVoy, comments?
Thank you. How many days do I have?
Uh-oh. You have 2.5 minutes.
I'd like to start then with working with the fire department. The two last fires burned within 2 blocks of my house. And the second one, I was waiting for Mission Canyon to burn. And I figured once the fire headed down Mission Canyon, it would not stop until it hit the mission, was the next fire break. So whatever the fire department tells you is how they're going to fight that fire, you don't need anything else but that. Okay? That's why I asked about organic material in the roof. I saw some very green trees very close to my backyard burn with 200-foot flames behind them. So organic roofs, it's not fireproof. I'd like to quote the director, if I might. You said it's about the site, it's about nature. The public's experience of this site is all about Mission Canyon. It's sort of very ramshackle, it's very compromised, but it's really kind of wonderful. There's something very uninstitutional about the site, and it's always been a delight. And I've spent more time outside the museum on the site than I have in the exhibit halls for any number of occasions, or just to walk the site and enjoy the architecture. And the architecture is a jewel. I couldn't agree more. It is one of the best examples of Hispanic architecture that we have. And what makes it? So look at the buildings. What makes them that special? And I've been around this commission long enough to know, looking at a footprint of a building and know when it's going to be successful and when it's not. This type of architecture can't be applied as a facade. It has to be in the organic form of the buildings. The courtyards, the massing of the building, the fact that they have an implied history in how things are sort of sometimes very orderly attached and not so orderly attached. That's what's so wonderful about the building that you have, is it has this implied mass that breaks up the building. That is all of the architecture. The form of that building is, there's more architecture in the form of that building than there is in decoration. It's not about decoration and frosting. It's about building form. So when I look at your building forms, I think it looks like a building out at UCSB, and you're not going to be very able to put Spanish architecture on that building, on those boxes. You're just not. The scale's not there. The relationship of inside and outside's not there. You talk about paseos, they're not, they're corridors. You talk about courtyards, they're not, they're spaces between buildings. Courtyards are contained. Look at the buildings that are there. They're quite wonderful. Copy them and be inspired by them. Otherwise, you're going to have a really rough time getting it through this commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner LaVoy. Commissioner Schwartz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start with some general comments and then move into specifics, if I might, and try very diligently not to be duplicative of anything that's already been said. First, I'd like to just talk about the museum, because I think that not only has it been a treasured resource, and I mentioned this a year ago in our comments, but also I think the key function, the key vehicle that the museum is, teaches us about who we are and how we are in the world and in our natural environment. And I, quite frankly, I almost can't think of anything more important than that at this point, for every generation. So the fact that the museum needs to come into the 21st century with the physical facilities to be able to teach and inspire that, to me, is critical. So I'm going to work very hard and hopefully creatively to help support you on your way, while also taking into consideration a number of very real factors for the neighborhood and the impacts to the neighborhood, because to me that is part of the balancing that you've talked about and I know that you're appreciative of. Let me reference the annexation issue first, continuing on with the general. I'm very supportive of annexation, and at every point possible along the way, I'm going to be advocating for that, because I agree with the way that Ms. Elledge has referenced it, and it's a cumbersome situation, and we need to bring the entire property into the city's jurisdiction. The fact that we're going to have to interact with our partners, the county, on this, and that you will have to, I think extends the process. It makes the process more expensive, and I'm not sure that we're going to get the kind of beautiful synergy we could if it was all under one roof, so one jurisdictional roof. So I'm very much in support of that. Additionally, I think that as you move forward, and I'm referencing the letter we received from neighbors, Mr. Solomon and Ms. Zimmer, I would like to see some of the mitigation measures in very clear, precise, comprehensive terms included in the application. I think the impacts are significant enough to the neighborhood, and they will be over a long enough period of time that this has to be concretely articulated in writing as a part of the application. So I'll be looking for that. In addition, I mentioned traffic circulation and safety. As we move forward, and on other occasions, I'll be asking more details from our transportation experts about how they're looking to justify this. I don't see that as a safe proposal. Although I understand your intentions, and I know they're well intended, I'm not sure that we're going to have unintended consequences there with the way it's configured in your proposal. Now, on the site itself, and I am not an architect, but have spent enough time moving here 44 years ago with my family to have developed quite an appreciation for the Spanish Revival style architecture. And someone, I think Mr. Schacht, mentioned the courthouse. I'll just say that even though the courthouse is a very large structure, everywhere you turn, right, there's this artistic beauty, artistic intelligence that's been used. Everywhere the eye lands, there's something inviting and exciting and stimulating. And I would hope, without overdoing it on this property, and given that it's nestled into a residential neighborhood, you're able to move forward with a slightly different siting, configuration, and design that respects that. And that I think, because part of what you're doing is exciting your visitors to beauty and nature, and then, of course, the human environment in conjunction with the natural environment. So you have an opportunity in redesigning your physicality of the museum to be, I would say, more synergistic, resonating greater with that. So for the architect to continue to work on. And then I think lastly, I would like to, excuse me, Phil?
Oh, thank God. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, he and I can go at it later. And then I would just say that, as I mentioned, the conditional use permit, and going forward, to include as much detail there as possible. The Planning Commission just recently went through, including the City Council, some very rigorous review and more stringent obligatory measures for some projects, so that there was a win-win between the applicant and the neighborhood. And I think that's going to be important here, whether we're looking at neighborhood compatibility, fire evacuation purposes, but I think it needs to come under the umbrella of the conditional use permit. So I think the more proactive and the more detailed you are with that going forward, hopefully that will help you move along in a more efficient timeline, and time is money. And we want to make sure that once you start this, I'll just speak for myself, we have a number of projects in the city that have stalled out, which causes me great disheartenment, that you can move along at a continuous pace and as swiftly as possible to implement the plan whenever it gets approved, in whatever form that takes, so that we can all realize the benefits in as expeditious time frame as possible. So I thank you, and I look forward to supporting this project as it moves forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. Commissioner Schallenberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, first, great presentation.
Yes.
Really, there's a lot of material here to cover, and you've really served your client well. Just as we move forward, I won't repeat any of the comments that I already agree with, but maybe take the checklist of comments and sort of address them item by item. I know there was a 21-point list, and I think you did essentially throughout your presentation hit each item, but maybe in subsequent reviews address each item specifically. And coordination, this was mentioned in the Historic Structures Report review, but coordination between the PRT and DART submittals and the Historic Structures Report, especially in terminology, use Luria instead of local birds, or both, or whatever, use the same designations. And I'd also like to see historic resources to be demolished highlighted and emphasized on these plans to a certain extent, so that there's clear designation of what's happening there. But otherwise, I just look forward to the project moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Schallenberger. I have a few, and then I'm going to just end this whole process, okay? Well, we have another applicant, and we need to respect them as well. You know, I had to continually ask myself if this is still the right site for the Museum of Natural History with this expansion. It is violating the site. It's also respecting it. We're striking a balance. I think what Ms. Naylor brought up with recalibrate my scale, that hit home. You know, it made me change my mind. But I do have to tell you that I continually have to ask myself, is this still the appropriate site for the museum? It's a great setting. I'm not questioning that. I liken it to the Getty down in Los Angeles and where they cited that. And they cited it at the top of a hill where everybody can see it. I am here, I am king. They ruined the hillside by putting a funicular on the hillside. I'm not going to pontificate on that, but reconcile the quantity, the parcel quantities, please, in all the reports. I think Schallenberger sort of alluded to that. The nomenclature, if it's the Luria, if it's the Fleischmann Mammal Hall, or if it's just the Mammal Hall, that kind of thing, that needs to be reconciled. One of the biggest pills for me to swallow is, or to continue to try to swallow, is the emergency access road. And I think that there are ways to protect the collections and protect the building and protect the neighborhood without such a intensive emergency access road. I'll leave it at that. The key to the success of this project is going to be to balance it with the neighborhood and the neighbors. You've worked with the neighbors. That's great. I heard from the public that there still is some concern about long-term noise, short-term noise, all of that stuff. So continue to work with them on that, and this will be a smooth project. Also, be careful with your statistics. Make them as clear and supportable, substantiated as possible. And what comes to mind is the oak habitat. I knew that number was skewed when I saw that 26,000. I agree with Commissioner Murray. I think that the historic element should be a priority. That really is something that's driving this. And then lastly, on page 17 of the project description and applicant report, you referenced the historic the Historic Structures and Site Report by Post Hazeltine Associates, and you have a date of May 2011. Just update, keep those dates consistent, because somebody will go looking for that and will find something that's incomplete or incorrect. That's it. Thank you very much. You have done a wonderful job of presenting, convincing. I think most of these commissioners. We look forward to you continuing on this journey. It's going to be a long journey, and that's what it is. It's a journey. You're not going to... it's not going to be without hardship and a lot of work. Okay? So
On that happy note.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we appreciate all your effort and your time.
I know.
Well, the
And you were
question is-
trying.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your good comments. Good to see you. Thank you.
Recess the Historic Landmarks Commission meeting for 5 minutes. And I ask that all people in the room that don't have business in the room leave the room, please.
Rosetta, in my heart, dear, there's no one but you. You told me that you love me, you'd never leave me, but somebody new. You made my whole life a dream. I prayed that you'd make it come true. Wow, Rosetta, my Rosetta, please say I'm the one dear for you. Carry on.
Back to the Historic Landmarks Commission. Planning Commission has pretty much left the room. And we will move to item number 3, which is a presentation item of artificial tree concealment structure materials. And I believe we have a presenter, Rank Ayers. If I mispronounced your name, I apologize. And it looks like we have Mr. Lamone.
Yes, I'd like to introduce the item. I'm going to invite Mr. Ayers up here because he's been nice enough to come and show us some of these new innovations in materials that are used for concealment towers. And the reason we invited him is because we actually have an application for one again in the city. And we thought because the technology has improved, that actually seeing the material would be helpful as you consider the next item. There's also been some recent installations in the county that have actually been installed. So the county's approved a couple, and we'd like to have Mr. Ayers explain what's available out there in the industry.
Mr. Ayers, you have the floor.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start with a few comments and then see if I'll just have questions from you, because I'm not exactly sure what the expectations are from this. My name is Rink Ayers. I work with Air Telecommunications. We're a consulting firm to almost all the different kinds of entities involved in telecommunications, whether it be the manufacturers, the carriers themselves, and sometimes work with jurisdictions. Just as to make sure that I am forthright with everybody, because of that, I do work with lots of the different companies there, so just be aware of that I'm showing you different stuff, but I'm involved with it as well.
Okay.
I normally offer to jurisdictions, our company, a presentation. It's a PowerPoint. It shows all the different things that are available in the telecommunications industry when it comes to concealing antennas and sites. This site particularly, I understand, is going to be a tower, or a tower is being proposed, and there's only certain ways you can hide towers versus rooftop things or freestanding structures. So the samples I brought are specifically for trees. There's a number of tree products that have been out there for a number of years. The first one came out in the late 90s. They were atrocious. They improved greatly over the years, but there is still a lot of difference in quality and materials that are used by the different manufacturers. And because the carriers are wanting to get their sites on as inexpensively as possible, sometimes there is different priorities as to what jurisdictions want and what the carriers want and the manufacturers provide. So I will show you some of the samples that we have here. They're from all the different manufacturers, major manufacturers of concealment trees. A lot of them are what I will call junk, okay, for lack of a better word. But let me take a step back and explain a few things about the process of the trees. First of all, the goal is, from the jurisdiction's point of view, is to conceal the tower so that it is not as noticeable by the general public. We want to mitigate what things look like. We don't want to have a tower that is worse than a regular monopole. It's a tower with just the antenna standing out. And frankly, oftentimes monopoles are the best solution when they're hidden in or in front of groves or whatever. A prime example is a tower that's in Ventura, right on the 101, eucalyptus along the frontage, painted dark green. You'd hardly notice it. Whereas sometimes a different structure would be actually more noticeable than that. Okay, but in places where you do want to conceal it, to have a tree, there are different ways of doing that. The problem that we often have is that when a proposal comes to the jurisdiction, they will give a photo simulation of what another site looks like, maybe adopted or dropped into a picture of that area. But there's no way for the jurisdictions to know that that's exactly what it's going to look like, because it really is just another site that's dropped in. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. One of the things that we recommend is that you have the manufacturer who is proposing to put a site in do a true 3D simulation. In fact, we're working on a site like that in the county up north, which is an oil derrick. I think it's one of the first in the area. I think there's maybe one other in Central California. But again, what is it supposed to look like? What does it look like with the antennas on it? So a 3D simulation was created literally down to the nut and bolt in that case, because they were giant fixtures. And you could see it from any perspective, and it was a true representation. You can do that with trees as well. So not all manufacturers provide that or offer it, but it is available. So if you were to move forward with a particular site and say, okay, what is this really going to look like, you can have that service offered, if it's needed, to show exactly what the facility will look like, what would it look like with some more branches or less branches, different kinds of branches. As far as trees go, there are a number of new products out there. Palm and pine have been the mainstay for the last 15 years. I think, just to interject my bias, I think palm trees are one of the best ways to go if the antennas are hidden inside the tree. Most palm trees, if you'll drive around and happen to notice them, will have the antenna sticking out way out of the fronds, and of course that's not doing much to mitigate it except there's a palm tree there. But there are great palm tree products that literally can hide the antennas inside the tree itself, and you'll never even see them. The beauty of those is palm trees are everywhere. They are the least obtrusive, in my opinion, and if you want to see photos of those, we can provide those. I didn't bring a whole bunch of presentations because I was asked to show samples. Pine trees have been around for a long time. Again, from the beginning, they were pretty atrocious. They've only gotten better gradually over time. But the fact is that most of them out there are still, in my opinion, subpar. There are 2 or 3 companies that offer good products out there, but there's a whole bunch that don't. So when it comes to trees, there are 3 main issues. Of course, the height of the tower that they're requesting, the size of the antennas that is attached to that tower and how far they'll protrude, and then how we're going to conceal it. The 2 major areas of concealment are the bark, how the pole is clad, and then the branches, which are intended to mimic a real tree and hide the antennas eventually. I have a number of recommendations in that regard as far as what's the best way to make that look. Sometimes planners, in their zeal, end up asking for a tree to be like a museum quality tree. We do make museum trees. I mean, literally trees that you could not almost tell that they're fake. And they do go in museums or theme parks or whatever. Very expensive. They're usually indoors, so they don't have to be exposed to the elements that have to have those issues. As far as the bark goes, here's some samples of different types of bark, different colors. You can paint anything you want. There are drawbacks. This bark is literally cast from a real tree. We literally go out to a tree. We literally go out to a real tree. We wrap silicone around it, and every nook and cranny of the bark is duplicated. And then urethane is sprayed into it. So there's the back. It's sprayed. It copies it, and then it's painted to match. The disadvantage to this is it doesn't last as long. This is what we use for museum quality, but it doesn't last as well. Here's a hand-applied bark. That's just put on a cardboard sonotube. The difference is not significant, especially when you're far enough away. I actually tend to make recommendations regarding bark, although this is beautiful stuff. It's very expensive. And from more than 20 feet away, you can't tell the difference. Really, what makes or breaks a tree are the branches. This is a sample of bark actually for a palm frond. You can see what we call the pineapple, or where they cut off the fronds.
It's actually upside down. There
Okay.
you go.
It was handed to me. I'm sorry. This is a radome. In other words, this is what you could hide antennas behind. So inside the palm frond, we can actually do it inside the bark as well. We have several trees that we've been involved with that have one set of antennas behind the pineapple, another set behind the bark. You can have at least 2 carriers in there, and you'd never know. Now, as far as now pine trees.
Sorry.
Did you have questions?
No, I did
I'm
not.
fine. Because the foliage has to be RF friendly, RF transparent, the radio waves have to be able to go through it. We can't use anything that has metal in it. There's only 2 manufacturers in the world that make foliage that works for pines. One's in China, one's in Mexico. Everyone uses them. They're exactly the same. And I would suggest that there be no major issues on that, except that the foliage can be painted to match, or even original dye color to match. It doesn't matter what kind of plastic you put outside, UV attacks it quickly. And what most jurisdictions have their biggest problem with is the fact that they start losing the coloration and you get that gray-blue look just from UV. The only way to address that is to have the foliage pre-colored. It's basically house paint. There's nothing fancy about it. This doesn't have it on it. But just like house paint, it lasts 15 to 30 years, and it will help the foliage last that much longer. Quite frankly, once branches are up on a tree, most people won't notice the difference between one manufacturer and another. The biggest the biggest characteristic that defines what a good-looking tree is and what one is not is really branch placement and branch length. Again, the 3D model can go a long ways towards addressing what the final tree is going to look like. The main issue when it comes to branches, in my opinion, and based upon experience in the field for 15 years, we've been involved with this almost from the beginning of the industry, is what the branches are made of. The preponderance of the branches that are out there, the manufacturers that make them, use PVC tubes. They literally take PVC, they heat it up, they bend it in different factions, and contortions, drill holes through it, stick other tubes into it. Here's a prime example. This is literally a PVC tube with another hole drilled through it, another tube, and then they slather gunk on it. This brings up what I consider the major issue of pine branches is their safety and longevity. Anyone who's worked with PVC knows that it goes brittle and it doesn't last. So PVC is going to break, especially, this is a major issue where there's snow, ice, or wind loads, but anything is going to eventually cause this to happen. This manufacturer's solution was to have a rope glued into the end all the way to the front, as if once this snaps, that rope is going to actually hold that branch in place for a safety factor. That lasted another 15 minutes of wind, and this was gone. This particular branch, or maybe not this one, but one like it landed on a car. That was a lot of fun for everyone to have to deal with. This is another PVC branch. It's coated a different way. Their solution to capping things off is not very creative. It's just fiberglass wrapped around it. But again, whether it's different kinds of PVC, it doesn't matter. Even when it's wrapped in fiberglass, it's going to break. So there are different cast branches. Here's one that is a cast resin. This happens to have a broadleaf type of leaf on it. This is, I won't comment on the leaves right now, but it's cast, but again, if it's not with the right material, it easily breaks. There's cast fiberglass. Again, not something that I'd want around my house because these break off and blow away pretty easily. Another form of casting is There's two. There's one there's one there too. That's unpainted. This one's painted. Is a cast urethane. Our recommendation, is that any branches that are installed would be cast. These are actually injection molded branches. They have huge 6-foot, 8-foot molds where the branches are shaped and contoured a little bit like a real branch as opposed to this PVC solution. And then the core of the branch actually has fiberglass laminated rods in them so that it can take almost any load. These things have been able to bend with the fiberglass. This doesn't have the fiberglass, and this is a side limb. But even with the fiberglass limb, they've been able to take 1,500 pounds of load and just bend, whereas everything else we have would snap. So as far as the core branches goes, it's really, whenever you approve, a jurisdiction approves a site, I highly recommend that you make sure you use branches that are going to be the best out there and that will last the longest. As far as foliage goes, the pine, I mentioned the actual tips. There's no options available out there. There's only 2 made in the world, and they're exactly the same of that kind. There is this. It has been flattened, so I apologize for that, but it's actually a pretty atrocious tip. It doesn't look like a pine when it's up. They have one of these in AG. Same issue with PVC in it. They break, and then this actually doesn't look that bad, but it doesn't look like much of a pine tree. There's all sorts of other foliage. There's broadleaf types. Again, the foliage, most jurisdictions don't pay attention to it, but you can get different size foliage. You can get different colors. It can all be custom made, but most of the manufacturers don't want to go through that trouble, although they all can do it. So this is just simply showing you that there's different colors and such. Another new option that has come out fairly recently is eucalyptus.
Is that what that is?
Well, yeah, exactly. For the first year or two, they were actually using indoor ficus plants. And the problem with these is that, well, you've seen the indoor ficus, these things just pop off. And in fact, if you go to the eucalyptus site at the coroner's office, it's actually a decent-looking tree. I think there's manufacturers do a better job of it, but they use this foliage, and it's just all over the ground. So again, if there's a point where you're going to
get away from my raking leaves.
I know, whether it's fake or real. What's up with that? This company has since switched to this. They've stuck with the ficus leaf, and they've stuck with the pop-on. It doesn't pop off as easily, but...
Oh, I can just see 9-year-old boys.
Well, if they can climb high enough to reach this foliage, and that's another thing. Real trees, I don't care what the species almost, they don't have foliage for the first third of the tree. I mean, that's just pretty much status quo. And yet, a lot of jurisdictions think you've got to get them all the way down to the bottom, the branches, for whatever reason. I say, do not do that. For safety, for aesthetics, whatever. There's a tree going up in San Luis in the county, and the San Luis planner said, down to 6 feet. Well, now you just got a climbing hazard for all those 9-year-old boys. This is one solution. Another solution, and these are all, of course, can be any color. They're injection molded. Here's how they figured out how to make their branch. They took that thing and just drilled holes in PVC and just stuck them in. Even these are loose. Oops, that shouldn't have come out that easy. They have these little ridges here that's supposed to hold it in the branch. I'm not sure how that's going to handle in a windstorm, but these pop off, these pop out. But again, just a little bit of glue and paint on a piece of PVC is not a structural item, in my opinion. And of course, we've tested all this stuff and proven that this isn't going to last very long. Another alternative to that, these samples, of course, are pretty squished, is solid injection molded. This company offers, of course, all these in different colors for whatever matches the species. These are the longleaf eucalyptus. Again, normally after a while, these would all hang down, they'd droop. All these samples would do that. So these are a little bit flat. But these would all droop and give a pretty realistic looking tree. Again, though, all foliage is going to wear over time. It's going to age. It's going to have UV issues. And so the real issue is making sure that you have some sort of control of how the carrier takes care of the product.
Okay. I'm going to stop you and ask the commission if they have questions for you, Mr. Ayers, unless you needed to add something, Mr. Lamont.
I just wanted to mention that we would, if we were to discuss the possibility of this type of concealment structure, require conditions that would require that be maintained as per what was approved. So that would also facilitate it being continued.
Commissioner Schallenberger, do you have any questions for Mr. Ayers?